Chapter 1108. Roman had a strange dream. The dream was full of corpses and thousands of dead people. The city was burning in a sea of fire and the buildings were dying. It was like hell. She dreamed that she had become a baby girl, bound in swaddling clothes and abandoned in a square. The buildings in the square were tall and majestic, but they were burned to ashes in the flames. It was not the architectural style of any city she had ever seen. It was neither Bragg's nor Ampier's seal. It was even more different from Cruz's aesthetic. Without Brando by her side, Roman began to feel afraid. She wanted to call for Brando, call for Freya, desperately make a sound, but in the end she could only cry. Her voice was clear and loud. Until someone came out of the fire. It was a group of knights. The style of their armor was strange. She had never seen this style of armor in Brando's territory. When the group of knights saw her, they immediately shouted in surprise. Roman had never heard their language before. They spoke quickly but she could understand. Found her. Kill her, demon girl. Thank you, Martha, we are saved. The knights shouted and pulled out their swords. However, before they could get close, suddenly a few beams of golden flames fell from the sky and hit the knights. The high-temperature jet passed through their heads and exploded into flames under their armor. Only a few pieces of twisted metal were left scattered on the ground. Then Roman saw some people in black and red robes coming out of the sea of fire. They did not say a word and directly picked her up from the ground. One of them looked at her intently. His face showed an indescribable expression, and he shook his head heavily. He said a sentence. It was different from the language of the knights before, but Roman could still understand it. What a nightmare. He reached out to kill Roman. But the people next to him stopped him. She is at least our most successful work. You can't just destroy her. This is the result of our joint efforts. Perhaps there are other ways. Everything will have to wait for the councilor's joint decision. The man holding the Roman hesitated for a moment, and his hands stopped in mid-air. This plan has completely failed. We might have no choice but to compromise. No, perhaps we still have a second option. The Druids' plan might not succeed. The Bronze tribe is ruthless and full of flaws. The council will never approve of them. This is not good news, my brother. But the monitors found that Martha was acting strangely. In the past few days, she had used 70 to 80% of the network's energy several times. Although it was very short, there were still traces. What is our great mother doing? Projection. She seems to be projecting something. The man was silent. He put down his hand. I'll test it out with her. The Roman dreamt that she was taken away from that city, and then she dreamt of another, more magnificent city, with many magnificent buildings, sacred halls, and many people in strange clothes whom she had never seen before arguing fiercely in her dream. Then she dreamt that she was locked in a dark place and then she slept for thousands of years. She sobbed in the darkness, calling out the names of Brando and Freya. She slept in her own dream, and in her dream she saw Freya, but Freya looked at her in horror and moved further and further away from her. She dreamt that she was in a small room and the room was a mess. 2 unfamiliar corpses fell at her feet. She dreamt of her aunt, who looked at her with a frown. She pointed at her forehead with her fingertips and muttered something. Then she woke up. As she cried, she trembled as she tried to find her way in the darkness. There seemed to be many strange scenes appearing around her. There was a group of cavalry, their bodies emitting fluorescent light, riding skeleton horses. There were also a few swaying skeletons, their eyes flashing with golden red light. There were also shrieking ghosts, emerging from the darkness. She found that she had come to Bucci at some point. On that night of escape, the army of the undead kept coming, but Brando was not by her side this time. Brando, Freya, where are you? She cried out in fear. Standing on the burning street, the Dragon Queen was shocked to see the thick smoke billowing and surging, forming rows of skeleton cavalry with spears in their hands. The riders were wearing tattered armor, and the ribs and spines were exposed between the leaky chain armor below their waists and abdomens. Their skinny hands held spears and they rode on bony horses. They charged towards her. The ground did not feel the slightest tremor, but the cavalry was already in front of her. The Dragon Queen did not move. Before the skeleton riders and their war horses crashed into her body, they suddenly collapsed with a loud bang and turned back into choking smoke. The Dragon Queen groaned. In front of her, the burning street returned to its previous state, as if the previous scene was just an illusion. But it was only a moment later. She saw a stag made of flames jumping down from a nearby roof, its hooves on fire as it landed in front of her. The stag was like the one Brando had seen in the dark forest. It was tall and handsome as if it was a perfect creature. The huge creature looked down at Gwendolyn from above, before turning around and heading back in another direction. The aura of divinity? Gwendolyn was a little shocked. She hesitated for a moment, and then chased in that direction. Countless spirits came out of the flames, screaming as they lunged at her, but each of them screamed and disappeared before they could get close to her. Woman and stag chased each other through the burning city, and every time Gwendolyn felt that she was about to reach the stag, it would suddenly disappear and reappear further away. If it had been anyone else they would have given up, but Gwendolyn felt something. She held an olive-shaped white gem in her hand, and it was slightly warm in her palm. "Don't worry, baby," the Dragon Queen replied in her heart. "I will be with you and we will succeed," she muttered to herself. Roman, however, dreamt of a tree. It was tall and lush and glowed faintly, like the legendary elven tree of the elves, the mother of the elves. Roman felt a little tired. She had grown a little, and now had the body of a 5-year-old girl. She came to the tree, curled up in a hole in the tree and fell into a deep sleep in her dream. The Dragon Queen suddenly stopped. She saw that the ground in front of her was suddenly torn apart, and countless burning thorns shot out from under the stone slabs, curling towards her. Her expression changed and she slashed out with her hand, and an invisible wind blade shot out from her fingertips, cutting the burning vines in half. The curled plants fell to the ground and immediately turned into sparks and disappeared. "That's the golden demonic tree." Gwendolyn finally recognized it. She saw the stag standing behind the burning thorns, looking at her with disdain, and her heart was filled with shock. She probably never dreamed that one day she would experience the feeling of being attacked by a descendant of Fenlidos. The tree herders planted golden demonic trees all over Wonde, but one day they were planted right in front of her door. Gwendolyn suddenly recognized the tree. The tree herders gave each of their experimental subjects a different number, and she recognized that the seed of the golden demonic tree was brought to Erewhon. "It's it." She finally understood. This was the girl's dream. She suddenly shuddered. The Will of Dusk had recovered so quickly, and just one of its dreams was enough to affect the real world. "I have to find her quickly. I have to be faster." The thorns moved again, and they intertwined to form a wall of whips that rolled towards her. The Dragon Queen let out a strange growl from her throat. If a draconic scholar was here, they would find that it was a sound that had been layered over 1,000 times, and it accurately weaved the 7 lines of law together. A blinding white light shot out from Gwendolyn's mouth, and the burning vines screamed as they melted. But to the golden demonic tree, as long as its body was not harmed, it would not lose its ability to fight. The thorns immediately rose from the ground and surrounded Gwendolyn in a dense cluster, intending to trap her. Gwendolyn immediately flew up, avoiding the annoying entanglement. No one knew the nature of the golden demonic tree better than she did. She looked around in the air, trying to find the main body of the golden demonic tree. However, it was at this moment that a white light shot towards her. It was only then that the Dragon Queen saw what it was. It was a stone worm, a creature that lived in the elemental plane of earth. It was a mortal enemy of the golden demonic tree, but now these two natural enemies were working together against her. The stone worm was at least 10 times larger than the ones Brando had seen before. Gwendolyn screamed in exasperation, "Mother of stone worm!" She was then sent flying. If one were to look down from above, they would be able to see that in a certain area near December Square, after a chain reaction, a row of burning buildings on a street collapsed one after another. Gwendolyn climbed up from the rubble, her face covered in dust. She patted the flames on her hair with her hand, but there was no sign of frustration on her face. Instead, her golden eyes lit up. She bounced up from the ground and a pair of huge wings spread out behind her back. She flew towards the Mother of Stone Worm in the air, and punched the body of the Mother of Stone Worm. It was as if the previous scene had been repeated, but the two sides had switched places. The Mother of Stone Worm let out a roar, and then flew back like a cannonball, crashing heavily on the ground. In a cloud of dust, it turned into smoke and dispersed. At this moment, Gwendolyn finally found the main body of the golden demonic tree. "Found you, little girl." She grabbed at the air with her divine hand, and the sage's power spread out, pulling the golden demonic tree up from the ground. After losing the nourishment of the dream, the illusion that appeared in the real world immediately shattered into pieces, turning into sparks that filled the sky and dissipated. In the Roman dream, the elven tree seemed to have suddenly withered. She climbed out of the tree hole in a daze and looked at the scene sadly. 2 ice dragons flew out of the thick smoke. Scram! Gwendolyn roared and tore them to pieces with her bare hands. But at this time, the Roman finally arrived at the battlefield of Ampere Seal. The Dragon Queen raised her head and looked at the huge shadow standing in front of her. Giant God Soldier. She gritted her teeth and said, "All for one, this is what you have done." The huge thing punched at her, and Gwendolyn did not dare to take it head-on. She quickly dodged. She knew that in the Roman dream the latter dominated everything, and the giant God Soldier left a deep impression on them, which meant that the strength of the latter was extremely exaggerated. The giant God Soldier punched the ground, and she watched as an area of about 300 square meters was turned into nothingness, and became a crater dozens of meters deep. The full power of a supreme-class attack was nothing more than this. But to the giant God Soldier this was obviously not the full power. It turned around and then swept its palm at the Dragon Queen. Gwendolyn knew that this could not go on, and she could only use her full power in her dragon form. But if she dragon formed, the holy temple of the dragons might immediately descend on her head. Gwendolyn obviously did not want to fail, so she had to find another way. She flew high into the air and landed on the arm of the giant God Warrior, before circling to its back and descending all the way down. The giant God Warrior slapped itself heavily on the back, the shockwave almost causing Gwendolyn to vomit blood. As a sage, she should not have been so weak, but the truth was that ever since she was injured in the Battle of the Evergreen Corridor, she had not recovered her full strength. But the shock wave also accelerated her fall, and she carefully avoided the feet of the giant God Soldier, and came directly below it. As expected, she saw the merchant lady standing on the street in a daze. The Roman's eyes were closed and her body was surrounded by black gas. She tilted her head slightly and looked at Gwendolyn curiously and suddenly asked, "Did Brando ask you to come find me?" The giant God Soldier made of thick smoke above their heads immediately disappeared. Gwendolyn stopped and looked at the human girl in front of her carefully. Speaking of which, this was not the first time she had seen her. Decades ago she had seen the Roman as an infant on the final battlefield. Then, near Vargas, she had seen this girl from afar, but the time was not yet right. She took a light breath as if to calm her agitated heart. "Twilight Dragon, in the end we still won," Gwendolyn said coldly. "Brando?" the Roman asked softly. She frowned slightly and showed a pained expression. "Brando? I." The merchant lady's voice gradually lowered, and then her tone became cold. "Are you the one who awakened me, mortal?" It was as if in front of such a great will, even a noble and powerful creature like a dragon was as insignificant as an insect. "Who are you?" the Roman asked. "The one who defeated you," the Dragon Queen answered quietly. Chapter 11:10. What's this? The little boy turned the thing in his hand over and over again, and then raised it up to take a closer look. It was a white metal cylinder with exquisite patterns engraved on its surface. "This is a knight's shin armor, the armor for his feet." The big man took the object from the boy's hand and placed a high helmet on the latter's head. The latter immediately felt darkness in front of his eyes. He hurriedly tried to lift the heavy helmet, but he accidentally knocked his head on a nearby charred wooden pillar, causing a burst of friendly laughter. The girl with the thick eyebrows couldn't help but roll her eyes at the crowd. She then glared at the big man, causing him to feel guilty. She hurried forward and took off the helmet, and the little boy, who was dizzy and disoriented, regained his sight and found his footing. However, after shaking his head vigorously, he looked at the helmet in the girl's hand with a pitiful expression. Seeing this, the big man couldn't help but laugh. The girl with the thick eyebrows glared at the boy. "Here you go." She then threw the helmet over to him. The latter almost fell to the ground before he caught the helmet. He hugged the helmet like it was a treasure and looked at her cautiously. "He's been a bad boy since he was young." The girl with the thick eyebrows cursed in her heart, causing a burst of cheerful laughter. Hippamera looked at the scene with great interest. Her aloof attitude made her a natural leader among the crowd, but the crowd took it for granted. It was as if a priestess would not be a noble if she didn't act this way. Someone explained to her, "Priestess, Pollux' father is a declining knight. The family's wealth is not enough for him to continue on this path, so he was sent to Rushta to be an apprentice. If he earns enough money in 2 generations, this title can be inherited. After all, he is still a noble." Another person added. Only then did Hippamela understand why the big guy had such prestige among the crowd. She nodded thoughtfully, and in the eyes of the crowd, it was an acknowledgement of their words. For a moment, their attitude couldn't help but become even more respectful. At this time, the big man patted the boy's head and praised, "You're a good knight. When I'm rich, you can be my attendant." The boy seemed to understand, but he still hugged his treasure tightly, causing the crowd to laugh again. However, the girl with thick eyebrows did not look happy. What's so great about being a lousy knight? You should just be my father's apprentice. When you've finished your studies, my father will naturally let you take care of the business. Yes, when you marry Miss Adega, we'll have to call you Mr. Lupak. The others coaxed. Bah. The girl with the thick eyebrows raised, blushing. The big man just smiled and shook his head. Everyone was joking, but their hands were not slow. They each picked up a defensive weapon from the ruins. Even the girl with the thick eyebrows pulled a crossbow from the scorched wall. The bow was a little burnt, but the string was intact. She then dug out a palm-sized dagger from the rubble and pinned it to her waist. The big man also instructed them to find a few sets of cotton-padded armor from the unburned armor rack. For untrained people, this was probably the only armor they could handle, but it was still cumbersome to wear. Fortunately, although the big man's family had declined, he had received a full set of knight education. Although he was not experienced, he was at least well-versed in the theory. He himself put on a chainmail and a breastplate. It took him a lot of effort to instruct the others to help him put them on. He also put on a light helmet, tied a belt around his chin, and pulled out a double-edged sword from the charred barrel. The sword was perfectly quenched, and its surface emitted a faint blue light. The big man very professionally flicked the edge of the blade, and a crisp sound was heard. As expected of the imperial capital. You won't find such a beautiful sword even in the best blacksmith shop in the countryside of Rosik. As he spoke, he carried the sword. He looked like a young knight on foot, or at least a knight squire. Hipamera tilted her head and looked at the armor. Too thin, too light. That was her evaluation. How could such light armor do the job? The Dragon Knight of the Temple of the Earth weighed at least half a ton when fully armed. Not including the mount, even a knight on foot could only reduce the weight of the armor on the upper half of his body. The armor on the upper half of his body was not much different from that of a Dragon Knight. In her mind, the assault armor that Rode designed for the subterranean dwellers was the most aesthetically pleasing. Of course, the weight of the armor used for charging and ambushing was naturally lighter than that of the standard armor used by the knights. However, she did not say it out loud. She knew that it was a matter of courtesy. Everyone thought that the high priestess looked down on these things. Of course, she did look down on them. They passed through 2 streets before arriving at this place. They were lucky that they did not meet a single secret society member along the way. Earlier, the wolves seemed to have scattered into the city, so the journey could be considered more daunting than dangerous. However, no one dared to guarantee that they would be so lucky in the future. The big guy happened to know that there was a weapon workshop nearby. Plus, the old man's legs were weak and he needed to rest at any time. That was why he suggested that they come here to take a break and look for some weapons for self-defense. Hipamera felt something when she passed by this area. Planeswalkers and cards of fate could sense each other, so when she heard the big guy's suggestion, she naturally agreed. Their luck was indeed good. When they arrived at the weapon workshop, it was only half burned down. The people in the shop had long run away. After they knocked down the wall to extinguish the fire, they actually found many good things in the shop and under the ruins. Everyone was in high spirits. Activities like dividing the loot were very popular. Although these weapons and armor were now buried under the ruins and abandoned like worn-out shoes, they were still worth a lot of money in normal times. Thus, they wore their helmets crookedly and held all kinds of weapons in their hands. It was a comical sight, but they were in high spirits. Hipamela didn't urge him. She went to the other side of the weapons workshop and muttered a few words. She stretched out her hand and pointed between the bricks. An imperceptible light blue light spread out from her fingertips and disappeared into the ruins. The girl with the thick eyebrows who had followed her all the way here looked at this scene with great admiration. She asked carefully, "What is this, High Priestess?" "My name is Hipamera." "This is a spell," Hipamera answered seriously. "A spell?" The girl with the thick eyebrows murmured. She thought to herself that this was a spell. This was the second time the priest had performed a miracle. He didn't seem to be like the priest of the parish who treasured his own spells. She did not know that the abilities of the priests of the parish were limited, and their work was often heavy. Every holy spell had to be carefully considered before they could be used to ensure that it was used in the right place. Hipamera continued to explain, "This spell can ensure that we can see the hidden magic waves." The girl listened as if she had fallen into a fog. She nodded as if she understood, but in her heart, she thought that the high priestess was very approachable. If it were the priests of the parish, they would not even bother to explain to the commoners. Soon, Hipamera saw circles of ripples seeping out from under the bricks. Some were big, some were small, some were thin, and some were dense. She ignored the others and only reached out to grab one of them. With a crash, something rose from under the ruins. The girl with the thick eyebrows was shocked. She knew that this must be another spell even without Hippamera's explanation. As for what kind of spell it was, she did not need to know. But she saw a pair of silver-white gauntlets rising from under the bricks. The gauntlets were made of light and thin metal. They were stacked on top of each other and strung together. The surface of the gauntlets was coated with a layer of silver-white metal. The surface of the gauntlets was engraved with dense and beautiful patterns. There was a finely carved silver sheep's head on each nail. On each sheep's head, there was a magnificent and fine ruby inlaid. It emitted a soft glow under the firelight. Ah! The girl with the thick eyebrows could not help but exclaim. The gauntlet floated towards Hippamera. The high priestess reached out and caught it. She did not care about the gauntlet itself. Instead, she put her finger on the inside of the gauntlet. There was indeed another layer of leather inside the gauntlet. She gently rubbed it and a golden card slid out from it. Before she had time to look at the face of the card bloomed with a golden light. When she held it in her hand, she found that the card had completely changed. First of all, the gold card had turned into silver. There was a picture of a nun holding a holy grail and chanting loudly. Ghosts surrounded her, but no evil could invade her. The words on the card read, Iron Hymn Faith IV Light 5, Earth 5. Enchantment, pay XMP and choose X targets to gain immunity 3. Immunity to damage 3 or below or increase defense by 30%. To maintain, the Iron Hymn will exist forever. But every time to maintain it to the next level, you will need to pay MP again. Will like iron, heart stronger than gold. Just as Hippamera's index finger touched the slightly cold surface of the card, she heard a voice in her heart. Hippamera? My lord. The high priestess was delighted. She did not even care about the card of fate and calmed herself down. My lord, I'm here. What's wrong? Why can I contact you all of a sudden? Brando's voice was a little puzzled. I understand. Maybe it's because I've just assimilated a card, so my planeswalker ability was automatically strengthened. Hippamera thought for a moment before answering. Assimilated a card? Hippamera focused her mind. The card and the gauntlet appeared in her mind. Brando was in the ruins of the Cat and Beard Inn, but he could not find any useful clues. There was still a trace of Gaia's blood left in the ruins. Other than that, there were also the corpses of the secret society's followers that were scattered everywhere. The angel Iroma was floating in the air. Her body had shrunk to the size of an ordinary person, but she was still serious and unapproachable. She was a demigod. Compared to the golden folk that Brando had seen, she was more sacred but less human. She reminded him of something like Milos, the god of giants, as if she was a pure war machine. At this moment, when Hippamera focused, he suddenly saw what the latter saw. He exclaimed softly. The first thing he noticed was the gauntlet. It could not be helped. It was like a player's instinct. A pale blue frame had subconsciously popped up on his retina. Is this a fake Fist of Tereos? What's the Fist of Tereos, my lord? The Fist of Tereos is part of the armor of Fanzin's strongest knight. In addition to its own attributes, excellent defense, each of the sheep's heads on the nail stores a powerful blessing. There are a total of 8. From left to right, they are the seal of virtue, the sword of benevolence, the shield of praise, the fearless heart, the crown of glory, the place of martyrdom, the words of respect, and the spirit of selflessness. Corresponding to the 8 virtues of the knight, the 8 blessings can raise the strength of the wearer to a level. Ha! Hippamera did not care about the light gauntlet at first, but this time she was shocked. So powerful? Of course, the one in your hand should be a fake made by a dwarf master. Although the workmanship is not inferior to the original, the blessings in the sheep's head can only be used once a day. It is not like the original, which is continuously effective. Brando glanced at the data on the pale blue menu. The attributes of the fake Fist of Tereos were slightly worse than the original, but at least it was the work of a dwarf master. The original inherited the consistent characteristics of the magic equipment in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, which only added a single attribute, giving it 74 points of strength. The fake used the new technology after the first era, giving it 44 points of strength and 15 points of vitality. In fact, it was also enough to reach the threshold of an ancient item. This was a rare fake that was almost the same as the original. My lord, your equipment? Hippamera wanted to say that in the last battle his equipment was broken into pieces. But Brando shook his head and interrupted her. This thing is more useful to you but not to me. It is one of the most suitable equipment to work with the will of the mountains. Unfortunately, if it was the original, this thing could make your combat power surpass mine. He shook his head in disbelief. The Fist of Tereos disappeared after the War of the Holy Saints with the death of the Knight Tereos, along with his famous knight's armor, Finality Hub. This thing had not been found by players in the Amber Sword, and according to everyone's guess, this thing should not be found in the new version yet. Brando looked at the card of fate. In comparison, he was not that surprised by this card. Since he became a real planeswalker, he understood that after the War of the Holy Saints, there were almost no real planeswalkers in WoD. However, there were many apprentices like Gerald who had 1 or 2 cards and had the potential to become planeswalkers. Chapter 11:11. According to Hippamra's description, the card was hidden in the glove, which meant that the previous owner of the gauntlet might have been a similar existence. He had a card and the card might have run through his entire life. At the moment of his death, he kept the card in this pair of equally precious gauntlets. The 2 items were passed down from generation to generation. Because ordinary people could not see the cards of fate, the secret of the gauntlet had never been revealed. Unfortunately, the card was assimilated by Hippamra's Planeswalker's rule as soon as she got her hands on it. Otherwise, he could have guessed the identity of the card's previous owner based on the card's appearance. As the most knowledgeable naturalist in WoD's knowledge in this era, Brando was quite confident. Keep the card. The gauntlet can be used now, Brando said. By the way, where are you? Did you see the Roman? The Roman lady? Hippamra asked curiously. What happened to her? Something happened. She's missing. Brando sighed in disappointment. What? Hippamra was quite surprised and quickly replied, I'm near the 12 Moons Square, my lord. Wait for me there. I'll be right there, Brando said. Okay. Hippamra nodded and left the telepathic link. Like most people, the thick-browed girl beside her could not see the cards of fate in her hand, nor could she hear the conversation between Hippamra and her lord. She only saw Hippamra spacing out for a while before regaining her senses. The latter did not dare to ask anything. Hippamra put on the gauntlets and picked up a ring from the ruins. She did not tell Hippamra that the ring was enchanted with a beautiful defensive spell. However, Hippamra's attention was attracted by the large emerald on the ring. She was overjoyed. When the 2 came out from behind the low wall, they found that the situation outside was quite different from what they had imagined. The relaxed atmosphere among the crowd was gone. With the big guy in the lead, everyone stood in the middle of the road. Even the grandson of old Aji's grandmother was no exception. Some of them even drew their weapons and confronted the secret society's disciples with stern expressions. On the other hand, the other side seemed to be much more relaxed. About a dozen disciples in black robes sneered as they looked in her direction, as if they were waiting for her to appear. They were not in a hurry to make a move. Seeing Hippamra walk out, one of them immediately shouted, Lord Priest, you're finally here. These guys want to drive us away. What happened? Hippamra asked. Himala's teachings were peace and tolerance, and she herself did not like to fight. If the other party also came for the weapon, it was not a big deal to give in. Anyway, those things are useless, she thought. Ask this guy. Someone was kicked out of the crowd. The young man in the black robe stumbled forward a few steps, complaining in his heart. He was the one who had secretly left the marks along the way, but he did not expect to be caught red-handed. He also did not expect that his colleagues would ignore his safety and directly block his way. Faced with Hippamra's gaze, he naturally stammered and couldn't say anything, afraid that this Miss Priestess would destroy him with a lightning bolt of divine retribution. At this time, the thunder of retribution had silently completed the version update in his mind. You go to the back and pay attention to your own safety, Hippamra replied. What? The young man was stunned. You won't kill me? Hippamra shook her head and didn't say anything. She wasn't familiar with this era, but she wasn't stupid. These disciples of the Black Flame sect were filled with killing intent. How could they care about leaving someone alive? If they were lucky, they might be able to survive, but that was only a small chance. At this time, the big guy in front suddenly turned his head and said, I think they are looking for you, my lady. Looking for me? The other party quickly answered her question. An old acquaintance walked out from behind the group of disciples. It was the Lord of Corruption, Andesha. She placed her hand behind her neck and gently pushed up her long hair. Her vine-like hair wriggled like worms, causing people to feel nauseous. But no matter what, she was still a charming woman, especially with her voluptuous body and towering breasts. She looked around and licked her lips. Little girl, we meet again. Where is your lord? Andesha's eyes were calm, but her heart was filled with vigilance. No one knew Brando's strength better than her. He was still an insignificant little fellow in the loop of trade winds, but her strength was nothing compared to his in just half a year. Even if she used her divine blood to undergo a second baptism. That little prince's blood is really delicious, this thought flashed through her mind. However, this still could not offset the fear in her heart. This was simply too terrifying. If someone had told her that drinking plain water could also increase her strength, she would have definitely pinched that idiot to death to prevent others from treating her as an idiot. But now she would probably still crush that fool to death. Drinking plain water to increase one's strength, what's the big deal? There were people here who could eat and sleep, and their breathing would become stronger. If Andesha knew about the game The Amber Sword, she would have screamed in her heart, "Jim, someone here is using a cheat." She was vigilant, but she could not go against the Dragon Queen's words. She was also someone she could not afford to offend. Andesha carefully looked at Hippamera, and her mind was spinning. I must stop these people, I can't let them ruin the Dragon Queen's plan. Frederick, who was summoned in a hurry, is still weak. It would be best if she could capture the little girl and use her to threaten that person. As long as Brando was not close to her, Andesha knew that the little girl in front of her was not her opponent. So she first used words to test her, trying to find clues in it, but she was wrong about one thing. Hippamera stopped talking the moment she saw the woman. At this time, the difference between an ancient priest and a modern priest was obvious. If it were a priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, they might have a verbal confrontation, but they would slowly prepare for battle when they could not gain the upper hand. However, Hippamela was the priestess of Himalud. In ancient times, priestesses were trained in such a way. They were warriors first and then priestesses. The harsh natural environment and the constant need to participate in the war to open up the territory of order required a qualified priestess. Even if Hippamera was a pacifist. But that was a pacifist for thousands of years. There was a big difference between their definitions. Miss Cleric didn't say anything and directly threw out the card that she had just obtained, Iron Hymn. 2 angels with trombones in their hands descended from the sky, and a choir sang hymns in the clouds as they slowly walked down a snow-white cloud path. The holy song descended from mid-air and integrated into the cloth armor, cotton armor, and even ordinary clothes of every citizen present. Then they were surprised to find that the cloth armor on their bodies gradually turned into shining chain armor in a white light, and the cotton armor became thick inlaid leather armor. The big Pollock became a fully armed dragon knight. The armor on his body seemed to weigh at least half a ton, but it was so light that it did not affect the latter's movements at all. This is a miracle. This is a large area blessing holy spell, it's a war prayer. The knowledgeable people had already cried out in surprise, but it was a pity that his knowledge was limited to this. Miss Priest is a war priest. The crowd exclaimed, and even the fear of facing the cultists had lessened. The cultists on the opposite side were even more restless. Looking at Hippamera's actions, who did not know that she was a military priest. A war priest was a high-ranking military priest, and it referred to monks and priests who would fight alongside the army, and not those who would clean up the battlefield, sprinkle water, and pray for the dead. Such priests were becoming rarer and rarer in this era, and people usually referred to them as holy knights. The reason why the Flame Knights of Cruz were so powerful was because they were also military priests. Most people who fought alongside them would feel safer and more at ease, but their enemies would often feel their scalps go numb. These were the elites of the Holy Cathedral. You're from Fanzan. Andesha finally reacted and shouted in exasperation. In this era, the war priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were used to taking the initiative to attack, and only the priests of Fanzan liked to use holy spells first. But she still recognized her wrongly. After all, the glory of the Holy Cathedral of Earth was something that happened before the Holy Spear of Heaven and the mountains and rivers were lost. It was so long ago that it was almost unreachable. Hippamera did not intend to answer any questions. Focusing on self-restraint was the basic requirement of a priestess on the battlefield. The enemies they faced in that era were the powerful dusk species, so how could they be distracted on the battlefield? The priestess was a little curious and thought to herself, this crazy woman isn't even fighting, so why is she chattering non-stop? If Andesha knew what she was thinking, she would probably vomit blood from anger. Hippamela chanted in a low voice, and several beams of light descended from the dark night sky, landing on top of everyone's heads, illuminating the entire street in a holy white light. Everyone who was within the light immediately felt their strength increase exponentially, and their mental fatigue seemed to have been swept away in an instant. They were so excited that they couldn't help but shout. It was like the sound of a bugle horn on the battlefield. A moment ago they were just a group of civilians, but now they seemed to have mastered the memory of battle. Their helmets were put on properly, and the long swords in their hands were not crooked. Their ranks were orderly and they were ready to attack at any time. This was her element, the land of holy light. This polarized defense and blessing element was one of the rarest AoE elements in the whole of the Amber Sword. This element was actually an element that was similar to the element of time. It allowed people to trace back thousands of years of memories and obtain the experience and skills they wanted from it. At this time, the cultists were no longer facing a ragtag army of commoners, but an army of ancient heroic spirits. If not for Hipamela's ability not being pure enough, these people would have sprouted wings and turned into an army of angels when the extreme planes unfolded. Hipamela used this ability not only to save the lives of these civilians, but also to use the light beam to guide Brando's position. She knew that when she drew the elements from the elemental pool, the Count should have known that there was a battle here. Endesha was stunned. She had seen blessing spells before, but she had never seen a blessing spell of this level. If the bishops of Farnazane were all at this level, then the Kurlutzians and the Wind Elves would not be far from being destroyed. She opened her mouth and tried to urge the cultists around her to hurry up and stop the small fries. But while she was smart, the others were not. Some of them were already cramping up their calves and were ready to retreat. You guys go and delay the disciples of the Black Flames. They are no match for you. I will deal with Endesha. Hipamela did not waste her breath on the battlefield. She shot out as soon as she finished her sentence. The ruby on her finger glowed slightly, and the power of the selfless spirit manifested. Endesha could feel her body brimming with energy, and her explosive power, reflexes and insight were all enhanced. She swung her hammer towards Endesha. Endesha's confidence was boosted, and she could feel the power of the selfless spirit surging through her body. Endesha could feel her body brimming with energy, and her explosive power, reflexes and insight were all enhanced. Endesha was not surprised but happy instead. After the second corruption, her strength was a level higher than when she was in the loop of trade winds. Now that she was facing Hipamela, her strength was 2 levels higher than hers. She did not expect Endesha to seek her own death. At this point, she could no longer be bothered with those useless disciples of the Black Flames sect. With a wave of her hand, a vine whip shot towards Hipamela, who was in mid-air. But when the vine wrapped around Mountain's descent, Endesha felt that something was wrong. Her law of corrosion did not have any effect. Of course, Endesha was thinking too much if she wanted to use her law of corrosion to corrode the divine weapon. At this time, the first sheep's head on Hipamela's left little finger glowed. The seal of virtue manifested. Faith and will, perfect spirit, supreme virtue. The ideal of a knight's life, the perfect spirit, manifested in Hipamela's body. This was a flawless will. If Brando's wall of will allowed him to deal with most mortal spells, then Hipamela could ignore some of the more fundamental things. In an instant, all the lines of law around Hipamela, whether it was the lines of law from the Holy Land or the lines of law from Endesha's elemental corrosion, all of them deviated and were no longer under Hipamela's control. Endesha's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Supreme will barrier, nullification of laws. Author's note, I said I would rest for a day, so I'm back. Chapter 11-12. The original seal of virtue of the Fist of Tereos was a continuous buff that could last for several hours, while the fake seal of virtue of the Fist of Tereos was an ability that could store mana. It could only be activated for 7 seconds a day, and did not need to be used all at once. After Hipamela broke through Endesha's erosion whip, she immediately closed the seal. In that instant, the ruby on her right little finger had dimmed quite a bit. She estimated that she only had 2 or 3 seconds left. If she reacted quickly, she could activate it twice, but if she reacted slowly, she would only have 1 use left. This was the second time she landed on the ground. Previously, she had covered a distance of 20 to 30 meters with a single step, and she landed firmly on the stone floor. As long as they were still standing on the ground, the power of Gaia would be continuously transmitted to them. With a slight increase in strength, the power of Gaia would be reflected back to the ground at 10 times the speed. The ground of the street exploded, and the priestess shot towards Endesha like a cannonball. Everyone could only see a shadow flashing past. Endesha could clearly see Hipamela accelerating towards her. Although this speed was nothing to her, she was still wary of the supreme will barrier from before. For a moment, she did not dare to face it head-on, and instead took a small step back. Hipamela saw Endesha taking a step back, and a thought flashed through her mind. Her hands did not stop moving, and she directly smashed the ground with her hammer. Endesha's battle experience was not inferior to Hipamela's by much, and when she saw this action, she understood her intentions. Get out of the way. The ruby on Hipamela's right ring finger flashed, and the sword of Shushan was activated. At this time she already had the power of Gaia, the Holy Land, and the Selfless Spirit buff, and with this buff she had 4 buffs. The mountains will buff her attack and strength up to 75 points, and the Sword of Shushan also provided a 30% attack buff, making her 97 points. With the addition of the strength buff, this attack was at the level of Brando before he was in the Koldu Manor. The hammer smashed into the ground without any fancy moves, and a visible shockwave spread along the street. Andesha's expression turned ugly. She could easily avoid the shockwave if she flew into the air, but even if she couldn't, it wouldn't affect her much. After all, the shockwave was only close to the level of a Lemeter. She stretched out her right hand and an arc-shaped green light shield spread out with her right palm as a fulcrum. When the shockwave collided with the light shield, the nearby ground immediately arched up. The impact pushed the soil and stone slabs to pile up in front of the light shield, but the latter did not move at all. It did not show any signs of breaking. The barrier protected Andesha and the disciples behind her, but the situation in other directions was not as optimistic for the Patriarch. The former could ignore attacks that were close to the Lemeter realm, but that did not mean that others could do the same. The shockwave swept past the feet of the disciples of the Black Flames and they were immediately sent flying. One after another they fell into the nearby ruins. The lucky ones only suffered broken bones while the unlucky ones were pierced by broken wooden stakes. Some of the unlucky ones even fell into the fire and immediately let out terrifying screams. Andesha's face was as black as iron. She did not care about the lives of these people, but she regretted her decision. She did not expect that this little girl would be so cunning. At this time the spectators in the distance were excited. Under the lead of the big guy they charged forward. The disciples of the Black Flames were already in a mess from the previous wave of attacks, and this time they were completely defeated. "You will regret this." Andesha screamed in anger. She was about to go crazy. She did not put Hippamera in her eyes, and her target was Brando who was behind her. She did not expect that she would suffer such a huge loss because of her carelessness. As if to prove her anger, accompanied by her scream, there was a sudden loud bang on the street. Something rolled up the soil from the ground and stretched out. That thing was so huge and had appeared so suddenly that Hippamela didn't have time to see it clearly. She could already feel a strong wind mixed with the smell of earth rushing towards her. She did not have time to react, but her instincts from the training in the Holy Cathedral allowed her to activate the ruby on her left middle finger. Her defense doubled, and with the 30% defense provided by the iron hide him, the surface of her feathers of light glowed with a metallic luster, and a faintly discernible illusory shield appeared in front of her. But all of this was useless. The huge object slammed heavily into the illusory shield, and the invisible shield immediately shattered into pieces. The unstoppable force continued forward and landed on her body. Hippamela was immediately sent flying, crashing heavily into the burning ruins behind her. "Miss Priestess! Miss Priestess!" Everyone could not help but cry out. Hippamela crawled out from under the rubble with much difficulty. Her snow-white face was bruised in several places, and blood flowed from her nose and mouth. She looked at the thing that had risen from the ground and realized that it could not be described with words. It looked like a tentacle, but its shape was constantly changing. What was even more surprising was that it was impossible to remember what it looked like just a moment ago. On the surface of the tentacle there were many human faces. Some were frightened, some were in pain, some were sad, and some were in despair. The only thing they had in common was that they did not have eyes. Their empty eye sockets were pitch black, as if they wanted to suck people's minds into them. This was definitely not something that should be in the material world. Hippamera could feel the evil and despair from the tentacle. The tentacle was 20 to 30 meters long, but she knew that its body was even bigger. This was not something she could deal with. "Run!" She immediately shouted to the others. Everyone did not react in time. At this time the tentacle pressed down on Hippamera again. Hippamera's right hand flashed and activated the glorious crown, martyr's stand, and words of modesty. She raised the will of the mountains and rivers in her hand. Bang! The tentacle pressed down on the cross warhammer. Hippamera felt her feet sinking, but she managed to block the attack. The glorious crown increased all skills by 5 levels for 15 minutes. Martyr's ground increased all attributes by 30% for 20 seconds. Words of reverence increased all attributes by 10% for 20 seconds. Words of reverence increased all attributes by 10% for 20 seconds. Andesha almost thought that her eyes were playing tricks on her. There was actually a mortal who could block Frederick's attack? "Miss Priestess, do your best." Everyone's hearts that had just been raised calmed down again. They could not help but cheer. The young disciple next to the crowd stopped himself from shouting. He couldn't help but sweat profusely as he wondered what was wrong with him. But Hipamera knew that this was not a long-term plan. Not to mention the short duration of the 8 holy seals, she felt that the monster did not use his full strength. It was as if he was toying with his prey. This was an evil god. As the priestess of Himalad, she was a believer of Gaia just like the tree herders. She was no stranger to these twisted creatures. She could even feel which Frederick was the evil god. The evil god Frederick, the most brutal lord of the ice plains. I have to get everyone out of here. A sense of responsibility welled up in the priestess' heart. This was the compassion and generosity inherent in the daughters of Gaia, the maidens of the mountains. The tentacles swept towards her again. This time Andesha also made a move. She was determined to get rid of this threat before Brando arrived. Otherwise, the combination of the young man and the little girl would be too terrifying. Pamela, on the other hand, revealed a card. Holy Song of Protection. A white light bloomed between Andesha and the tentacle's attack. This card was converted from Enrolda's holy ring. It made people immune to all damage, so Hipamera was not injured. Instead, she used the force to fly far away and landed beside everyone. As soon as she stood up, she immediately shouted to the girl with thick eyebrows not far away, "Take everyone away." After her previous observation, she already knew that the most authoritative person was the big guy. But for the big guy, Miss Adagia's words were the most important. Although the girl with thick eyebrows had only been with Hipamera for less than an hour, she believed the latter's words very much. She quickly said to the big guy, "Listen to the priestess' words." At this time there was no need for her to remind them. The others had already seen that the priestess was not a match for the terrifying monster. Of course they did not blame Hipamera for not doing enough. After all, everyone could see how terrifying the tentacle was. Most ordinary people did not know that the strength of a monster was not directly related to its size, and this was even more true for the evil gods. As soon as Hipamela opened her mouth, they immediately scrambled to escape. The big guy wanted to pull the girl with the thick eyebrows, but the latter slapped his hand away. "Go help grandmother," the latter said loudly. She then helped the injured Hipamera up and prepared to chase after the others. The grandson of Aji's grandmother followed beside them, but he was not afraid at all. The girl with thick eyebrows could not help but pat his head. "Good," she said, "you will be a great hero in the future." The little boy immediately puffed out his chest. Everyone fled along the streets. Andesha was not worried when she saw this scene. She only laughed disdainfully. If the great lord of the frozen plains, Frederick, allowed a group of ordinary people to escape from him, it would be too laughable. As expected, in just a few moments, dozens of tentacles shot out from the ground from both sides of the street. These tentacles were separated by dozens of meters, and no one knew how big the evil god's main body was. As soon as the tentacle appeared, it immediately swept towards the crowd. It could have easily caught up with everyone, but it calmly started to attack the slowest person. The latter screamed as he was rolled up, and then it crushed him, turning him into a rain of blood. A thick sense of despair enveloped everyone's heads. At this time, even the stupidest person could see that the other party was simply toying with them. Hipamera also seemed to have seen through this. She stopped and pushed the girl with thick eyebrows aside. "You guys go first, I'll bring up the rear." "Lord Priestess?" The girl with thick eyebrows was stunned. She looked at Hipamera in a daze, unable to say a word. The others who ran far away also stopped. They looked back and shouted, "Adagia, Lord Priestess, what are you doing? Hurry up." "Lord Priestess, she said." The girl with thick eyebrows stuttered. "I'll bring up the rear. You guys run or none of us will be able to escape." Hipamera repeated to everyone. Everyone was stunned. The priestesses of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would never say such a thing. Their duty was to maintain order. Although the protection of civilized society and ordinary people was required by the doctrine of the Path of the Golden Flames, it did not include self-sacrifice. In this era, in many parts of Wonde, the religion's definition of protection was derived from this. It was illogical for the priestesses of civilized society, especially the high-ranking ones, to sacrifice themselves to protect ordinary people. Civilization had taken root in this troubled land with so much difficulty. In the eyes of most ordinary people, every outstanding individual should be protected so that they could play a greater role in the world of order, and not die for some insignificant people. The priestess was so outstanding and she looked so young. She should be a genius in any holy cathedral. How could they let a genius die for them? Such selfishness would make even the most despicable person feel ashamed. Everyone subconsciously stopped in their tracks and said loudly, Lord Priestess will go with you. You guys go. Hippamera smiled. The scene in front of her reminded her of the past in the holy cathedral of Earth. Every mother's child was glorious and proud before they lost this glory. I'm the priestess of Himalud. Mother's daughter. The girl with thick eyebrows opened her mouth. My lord, we can't let you die for us. I won't die. Hippamera was certain as if she was stating a truth. My lord will come to protect me. My lord. The tentacles had already crushed 2 rows of houses on both sides of the street and came behind them. The girl with thick eyebrows looked over there with extreme fear. The big man behind her was so anxious that he wanted to rush over and carry her and run, but he knew that he could not do so at this time. Hippamela then looked at the black-robed young man, who had followed them all the way here in a muddle-headed state. You should run with everyone, she said. I'm a disciple of the Black Flames. The young man replied in shock. My lord. It doesn't care who you are. Hippamera pointed at the approaching tentacles. Oh. The young man's head was full of sweat, and his long curly hair was stuck to his forehead. He refuted loudly. I mean, I'm a disciple of the Black Flames. My lord, don't you care? Chapter 11:13. You are a disciple of the Black Flames. Hippamera smiled. Do you know the origin of the disciples of the Black Flames? The young man was stunned. Pandora's box was opened. Wars and plagues, monsters and disasters came one after another. This was the origin of the so-called calamity of civilization. That was the most glorious era of the Temple of the Earth. The daughters of Gaia and the Myrnas protected this world of civilization and order. In that era, Hippamera knew that there was a group of people who had lost their families and loved ones because of the invasion of monsters. They swore revenge and used the Black Flames as a mark to be enemies with the monsters for the rest of their lives. They were called the 3 Swords of Civilization along with the Temple and the Legion. But as time passed, the swords had decayed. She gave the big guy a look and the latter immediately rushed up to pull the girl with the thick eyebrows and ran. Everyone finally began to turn around. The young man in the black robe was stunned for a while before he followed hesitantly. He thought for a while before he tore off the brooch that represented the secret meeting from his robe and threw it into the ruins at the side. Behind everyone, a dozen tentacles finally caught up with Hippamera and pressed down on her together. Miss Priestess. The girl with the thick eyebrows could not help but scream. Hippamera's figure disappeared. Frederick's tentacles surrounded the priestess in the center. They intertwined with each other and there were thousands of faces on them. These faces changed their expressions and let out lingering whispers, like a low sigh in the ear, whispering and not stopping. Hippamera felt a voice squeeze into her mind. That voice was like hundreds of voices overlapping. They repeated different intonations and different contents. It was buzzing and noisy, but it made her understand the content. They have betrayed you. The Temple of the Earth no longer exists. I recognize you, little girl. You are the priestess of the Temple of the Earth. You do not belong to this era? Hippamela pursed her lips and frowned as she stared at the big guy. She was still a little afraid in her heart, but she was the shepherdess of Himalud. She had to stand here and watch over the flock of sheep on behalf of the goddess. She took a deep breath and her chest heaved up and down. I know you too, Fredridge, and I cannot be deceived by your sweet words, she cried. A low chuckle squeezed into her mind. Hee 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 hee. But I found something interesting in the way these people think. Do you want to see it? What a pity. The once glorious holy cathedral has now become a vassal of the barbarians. Do you know how the Earth Holy Hall was destroyed? The cacophony of voices was incoherent and annoying. With thousands of tones overlapping together, it was as if there were thousands of people chattering in one's head. Those mortals don't understand at all. How arrogant are you? They only know how to seek personal gain. They killed your companions and betrayed your faith. You don't fit in with this world. Hippamera was silent. The last sentence pierced her heart. The young girl's eyes sparkled. She opened her mouth slightly, but her heart was filled with softness. She understood that she was indeed incompatible with this world. This was not an era that belonged to her. Hippamelud was the king of the mountains. Her arrogance made her throne carved at the peak of the mountains, under the howling cold wind all year round. Her priestesses were equally arrogant. Every shepherdess was the most outstanding and beautiful young girl among their peers. Their hearts were pure and flawless, their wills were firm, and their status was incomparably respected. This arrogance was innate, as if they were naturally above the mortals. They protected the mortals like a flock of sheep guarding the goddess. Because the sheep were weak and needed their protection. They were strong so they could show mercy. But that era was over in the end. From the moment she was summoned to this world, she understood this principle. This was an era of mortals. Hippamera silently put away the arrogance in her heart. She was a smart girl and knew how to protect herself. She learned to smile politely as if she was gentle and approachable like the girl next door. She looked at this world without saying a word. Because she understood that she was incompatible with this world, she only evaluated this era in her heart. Backward production techniques, old weapons, weak strength, undetermined fighting will. This was the era of mortals. Perhaps it was still warm but too weak. If the goddess was still here, would it be different? How would such a world fight against the twilight? She felt a little strange. She did not understand why Lady Martha and the gods would make such an arrangement. But on the other hand, she did not dare to look up the history books about the past. She understood that she was afraid. Because arrogance could not tolerate mistakes. They can't even learn to be reverent. They only have cheap gratitude. But it will soon disappear and they will forget you completely. Only worship and reverence can be maintained for a long time. Go and kill them, Frederick's voice guided her patiently. But the last ruby on the sheep's head nail lit up automatically. A knight's fearless heart came from a fearless spirit. It eliminated all fear and confusion, and was immune to all interference from the mind and will. It blocked the soul and cleared the mind. Hippamera suddenly woke up. The confusion in her eyes disappeared, and her gaze became more determined. Arrogance will eventually lead to destruction. Nothing lasts forever. The glory of the Temple of the Earth is just a part of history. Its survival is just a moment to the world itself. She opened her mouth and answered, "Ha ha." Listen to this arrogant tone. Look at this high and mighty priestess, commenting on the progress of history with the eyes of mortals. How arrogant. It seems that you still don't want to give up your position in the past. Frederick's sharp and thin voice retorted. It was like the shrill noise of a file. Hippamera looked up at the intertwining tentacles and replied loudly, "Frederick, you can't confuse me. My personality is not my weakness. I've never been ashamed of it, because the pride in my heart is not the source of my blindness. And because I've seen many people better than me, Frederick. Even in this era, it's the same." Frederick fell silent. After a long while he said sullenly, "Oh? There's actually someone who can make a priestess of Himalaya say such a thing. How puzzling. You're lying, little girl. Disappointing, detestable. The era of the ancestors is over, leaving behind a disgusting world." Hippamera smiled and said with admiration, "That's because you haven't seen him. He can be an enemy of an empire for a promise. He's not strong, but he's brave and strong-willed, humble and clean. He doesn't have any of the bad habits of the nobles. He's neither frivolous nor arrogant. The ideals and beliefs he carries are so pure, as if they came from the sages of ancient times. It's no exaggeration to say that I'm full of reverence for His Excellency." Frederick's voice buzzed as he recalled. In the end it turned into one. The reverence of a priestess of Himalaya is puzzling. Let me see the little thoughts in your heart. The seeds of deceit will sprout in your mouth. You can't deceive yourself, little girl. Tell me, who is that? Hippamera replied with a smile, "My lord." A mortal? The voice was full of disdain. The former sighed softly and looked at the terrifying tentacles in front of him with a strange expression. "This is the era of mortals, Frederick." "So what?" Frederick replied with a thick sense of contempt. "You're counting on a mortal to save you?" "My lord won't save me," Hippamera replied. "He's here to kill you." Frederick let out a deafening laugh, and more than a dozen tentacles trembled as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. A mortal kill him? Brendel sneezed loudly, and he could not help but furrow his brows in confusion. Ever since he entered the gold rank, natural diseases were no longer able to affect him. His body was 100 times stronger than a normal person, and it was an understatement to say that he was like a bull. Could it be that someone was spreading an unnatural plague around here? He knew that Andesha and Mayad were in the city. Even though the latter was dead, who knew how many patriarchs there were in the city? Tree herders loved to play with these filthy things the most. Ever since Hippamera's last communication with him, he could no longer connect with her through telepathy. However, he could feel that her elemental pool was weakening, and he guessed that she was in a battle. Who knew if she was a tree herder? Or more likely, she was a tree herder. His gaze swept across both sides of the burning street. At this time, most of the buildings in the South City district had been burned down. Only some embers were left of the 2 rows of houses. The non-burning bricks still maintained their original structure, but without the support of the wooden structure, it was hard to say how long they could stand. Soon he saw a group of refugees. The group slowed down as they walked. The girl with the thick eyebrows was the first to stop. The others seemed to be infected by her and stopped one after another. No one spoke. This was the best outcome. They were lucky to survive with only 2 or 3 casualties. The holy cathedral was right in front of them. As long as they reached there, they would be safe. However, they did not feel the slightest bit of joy in their hearts. The atmosphere was oppressive and no one knew what to say. Normally, when their lives were in danger, most of the people here would be more than happy to have everyone stand behind them to protect them, as long as they could escape with their lives. However, at this time they felt as if their feet were filled with lead, and they could not move anymore. The boy did not understand the adult's silence. He kept asking where the priestess was. He wanted to turn back to look at her several times, but he was stopped by the tall man. The tall man did not say a word. He was a knight, but he took off his helmet and threw it far away. The girl with the thick eyebrows held his hand. Her heart was heavy, but she could not blame anyone. What was the use of them staying? "Priestess won't die," she muttered. "She said that the Lord will come and save her." She was so sure. The Lord? But how can a priestess have a lord? Someone asked. Everyone quickly thought of the reason. She lied to us. She was worried that we would not leave. When this was said, everyone became silent. There were only a few cold-blooded people in this world. Although some people were selfish, it was only because of their survival instinct. Everyone present felt their throats tighten. Something seemed to have appeared in their dry eyes. Some of them blinked their eyes desperately. The young man in the black robe silently followed behind everyone. But for a moment he felt that he saw something. When he turned back, he saw that there was nothing on the street. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if he had been thinking too much recently and was hallucinating. But his mind was in a mess. He did not know if he was thinking about where to go after leaving the secret meeting, or if he was thinking about the priestess' last words. Do you know the origin of the disciples of the Black Flames? Of course he knew the origin of the disciples of the Black Flames. The bishops used this as the glorious history of the secret meeting. But there were not many believers in the lower class who believed in this. Many people joined the secret organization for various purposes. Most of them were just seeking protection. He was one of them. After hearing so much, perhaps he had accepted his identity. But subconsciously, he still did not believe that the disciples of the Black Flames had such a glorious origin. Are we really fighting to cleanse this world? Asking himself, the young man felt that there was no answer to this question. But he could feel that the priestess did not look at him with any discrimination. She was not filled with disgust like the nobles. He thought about these things and turned around again. But he was shocked to find that everyone in the room had silently taken a step back. It was as if he was suddenly standing in the middle of the crowd. What is going on? The young man was shocked. Then he heard a voice that he did not want to think about even in his dreams. It was as if it came from the deepest part of a nightmare. "Excuse me, the priestess you are talking about, is she such a lady?" Such a polite way of asking a question was like a noble's, but the other person's tone was not disrespectful or condescending. Instead, it was gentle and approachable. Everyone looked at the young man who suddenly appeared in front of them. He is a count. The big man thought. This person is not Cruz's man. Perhaps he is the lord of the priestess. The girl with the thick eyebrows had such a thought in her mind. Chapter 11:14. Excuse me everyone. Is the priestess you speak of a lady like this? The young man's expression was solemn. He stretched out his palm with his palm facing down. Everyone saw a cloud of dust gather between his palm and the ground. The glittering dust swirled and formed a picture. It was Hippamela's appearance. "Ah, sister priestess!" the boy exclaimed in surprise. The young man raised his head and looked at the crowd. "My name is Brando, Hippamela's friend. Please tell me, where is she?" "You are her lord?" The young man Brando nodded. "You will save her, right?" The girl with the thick eyebrows asked carefully. In her eyes, although the young man in front of her was wearing tattered clothes, he had an indescribable temperament, just like the palace knights outside Cephas's gate. He was calm and composed, and his manner of speech was extraordinary. Moreover, his skin was white and smooth. He did not look like a commoner. "What happened to her?" "Lady Hippamela was stopped by a monster in order to protect us." The big guy looked at Brando cautiously and answered in a low muffled voice. "What kind of monster?" Brando asked again. "Where is it?" "Sir," a voice came from behind. Everyone looked back in surprise and found that the one who spoke was the young man in the black robe. The latter's head was covered in sweat as if he had just been fished out of the water. He raised his hand and said to Brando, "I will take you there." Brando looked at the young man and glanced at the pattern of the black robe. Disciple of the Black Flames? He thought. But he knew that there were many low-level disciples in the disciples of the Black Flames. Most of them were blinded by temptation, so he did not mind and only replied, "No need. Tell me, what kind of monster is it?" Everyone's heart sank, thinking that this young man still had the mood to ask questions at a time like this. The girl with the thick eyebrows furrowed her brows, and her eyes revealed a look of disdain. She probably thought that he was one of those noble youths who looked elegant on the surface, but was actually a coward who was afraid of death. If she told him how terrifying the monster was, he would definitely find an excuse to avoid it. If it weren't for her grandmother gently holding her hand, the young girl would have been unable to hold back her sarcastic remarks. Brando didn't think too much about it. As a qualified warrior, understanding the enemy was a basic skill. Otherwise, it wouldn't be saving people but putting himself in danger. He knew that in this city, there were not many monsters that could threaten Hippamela, and whether it was the horseshoe beetle or the evil god Frederick or anything else, they could also pose a threat to him, so he had to be careful. Brando understood what they were thinking from the looks of suspicion on their faces. He couldn't help but shake his head, but he didn't explain because there was no need to. He waited for everyone's answer. We didn't see the monster's appearance clearly, but we saw many tentacles that looked like octopus tentacles rising from the ground. The young disciple replied. He was the only one who didn't think that Brando was afraid. He was even a little afraid. Not long ago, this face was his biggest nightmare. Tentacles? What kind of tentacles? Every tentacle was taller than a two-story house. It was as thick as a person hugging it. There were many human faces on it. The young disciple thought for a moment before answering. That's the evil god Frederick. Brando understood. What did he say? Evil god Frederick? A few whispers came from the crowd. The legend of the angel Aroma was widely spread in the Bankdale region. As the other half of this legend, the evil god Frederick was the best way for mothers to scare the naughty children in this area. In other words, almost everyone in this area grew up under the shadow of this great demon king. Frederick would often come in the night to kidnap the naughty children, or take away their candy, new clothes, pillows, and other trivial things. In terms of tiredness, this evil god might even surpass the sanctum to become the busiest person in the capital. And naturally, his name was deeply ingrained in the hearts of the people. They actually summoned an evil god. The young disciple's face turned pale, and he almost fell to the ground. It was clear that he had long suspected this, but he didn't dare to confirm it. Is what he said true? Someone grabbed his collar and asked fiercely. But the girl with the thick eyebrows didn't look at them. She thought to herself, evil god Frederick, what a good excuse. He'll definitely find a way to avoid it. It's not worth it for the priestess to have such a lord. She looked at Brando with disdain. In her eyes, the latter was the most useless of all. Brando saw that the crowd was about to push the young disciple, and he quickly interrupted them. Where is that monster? I mean, where did you and Hippamela get separated? His question startled the girl. She thought that he would leave immediately, but her preconceived disgust made her explain herself. Let's see how long you can pretend. Sir, I know. It's just south of here, less than 3 streets away from here. The disheveled youth hurriedly broke away from the crowd and came to Brendel's front, gasping for breath. That's the east side of the 12th month square. There's a dwarven weapon workshop there, right? Brendel asked. That's the east side of the 12th month square, isn't it? The crowd couldn't help but look at Brando in surprise. They probably didn't expect a foreigner to know so much about Rusta. If it weren't for Big Guy, many of them wouldn't have known that there was a weapon workshop there. Even Big Guy himself knew very little about the owner of the weapon workshop. Yes, the young disciple quickly answered. At the same time he asked, Sir, do you need me to lead the way? I'm not afraid of danger. Brando looked at him and shook his head. You're not afraid of danger, but I have to be wary of you. You're a disciple of the Black Flames. Besides, I really don't need your help. He pondered for a moment. In the eyes of the crowd, he seemed to be hesitating. The disdain in the girl's eyes became more obvious. Even the young disciple's heart sank. He thought to himself, is this lord really planning to escape? However, the young disciple slightly agreed. After all, it was the evil god Frederick. Frederick was a real god. Just like them, what could a mortal do if they went there? Brando didn't have the heart to care about what these people thought. He closed his eyes and his perception of space spread out like water. In an instant, it spread over an area of a few thousand meters. This was the new ability of his elemental mastery after reaching the peak of the elemental laws, spacetime control and spacetime perception. If there were gold or elemental masters in the nearby streets at this moment, they would see such a strange scene. The lines of law seemed to have come alive as they passed through the streets and alleys. Tracing back to their source, they would find that the dense silver lines had gathered into a huge cocoon of light. Flashing information streams gathered from all directions and summarized into Brando's mind. Unfortunately, the people present were all ordinary people. They couldn't see the spectacular silver lines of law surrounding Brando at this moment. Only the big knight faintly sensed it. He was still looking left and right, suspecting that he was hallucinating. He had learned some knowledge about elemental mastery from his father, but it was too far-fetched. It was said that only his grandfather's father's generation had barely touched the realm of elemental mastery. He had no idea that the young man in front of him was an elemental mastery master. It was obvious. How was this possible? Everyone spent a few long seconds in doubt. During this time, the girl with the thick eyebrows wanted to speak several times, but she was stopped by her grandmother. Grandmother Aji's this person? She couldn't help but feel a little angry. The old woman only shook her head at the girl. Offending a noble would bring a lot of trouble to the family. She had lived to this age and had seen many of it. She couldn't let this girl be foolish. Besides, it wasn't necessary. Although she felt pity for the approachable Miss Priestess, the girl with the thick eyebrows seemed to respect the old woman, so she could only shut her mouth and sulk. After a few seconds, Brando finally opened his eyes again. Just when everyone thought that this noble young master had considered saying some polite words and retreating, he only raised his head and said to the sky. About 2,700 meters. You can see it too. Everyone looked up. Above them was a pitch-black night sky, but it was reflected red by the fire in the city. But other than the billowing smoke and dancing sparks, there was nothing else. There was no response from the void. Only Brando's calm voice echoed in the empty streets, as if it was a matter of course. Everyone looked at him strangely. Could it be that this noble young master was too thin-skinned and couldn't find an excuse? Had his brain been fried? Very well, since you can see it, Brando spoke again after a moment. Head 3 streets south from here. Aim at old Sarden's weapons shop and blast it for me. Before anyone could ask what was going on, all of a sudden, a thin golden line was reflected in their eyes. Everyone was dumbfounded. Even the girl with the thick eyebrows who was about to question could not help but subconsciously shut her mouth. The golden line descended from the clouds and pierced through the night sky. The clouds slowly rotated at its starting point to form a vortex, and the golden line fell vertically to a certain location in Rushta City. If they were not mistaken, it was 3 streets south where they came from. Frederick, who was sneering, suddenly froze. In the distance, Andesha also looked up at the golden line hanging from the sky. She did not know the angel Aroma, but she knew this method. This golden line was connected to the constellations of the war dragon Tiamat and the platinum dragon god Bahamut. Someone was directly mobilizing their power. This was definitely not the power of a mortal. Unless the 2 world dragons came in person, only the highest authority could mobilize such an attack. Was it Martha? Or was it the Holy Lance of Heaven? But it wasn't. A golden holy sword was reflected in Anderson's eyes. It shone brightly and hung alone on the peaks of the mountains. One of the 12 tree shepherds patriarchs subconsciously took a step back. An extremely uneasy feeling shrouded Frederick. This feeling was too familiar. He did not know how long ago when the same terrifying aura almost completely annihilated him. Aroma? It let out a tragic scream, and its huge body instantly shrank down. Countless tentacles seemed to want to immediately drill back into the ground. But it was still a step too late. Right in front of Hipamera, a golden light was reflected in the girl's eyes. It fell along the golden line, and under her smiling gaze, the golden light went straight into the ground. With a loud bang, continuous flashes spread along the entire street. Countless mud and stone slabs were lifted up from the ground. Frederick's tentacles under the ground were retreating at a speed visible to the naked eye, but they were still caught by the explosion. The tentacles seemed to swell and then the whole thing exploded. Suddenly, flesh and blood splattered everywhere. Then, more and more tentacles were blown off and flew into the sky. The flash continued to move forward, like a sharp knife cutting the ground. Soon, Frederick's body was exposed under the open air. It was an extremely ugly, twisted mass of flesh, as if countless human bodies were mixed together and formed by intertwining with each other. Fortunately, as soon as this disgusting scene appeared, it was hit by a ball of golden light. Amidst an earth-shattering scream, the ball of flesh completely exploded, turning into blood and minced meat that filled the sky. Then it fluttered and fell to the ground. It was as if it was raining blood. "How dare you sneak attack me, Aroma?" Frederick's voice was much weaker than before. It shouted hatefully, "Follow me and I will soon have my revenge." Then the buzzing sound completely disappeared. Thousands of meters away, the people who witnessed this scene were completely stunned. They turned their heads stiffly and looked at the young man. If they had thought that he was just a useless rich second generation before, they couldn't help but start to guess who he was now. And what was that terrifying spell, just now? But Brando did not care about them. He pulled out his sword and said to the void, "Your old opponent is not dead yet. Go after him, I will deal with Andesha." Frederick is a monster born from Gaia's mother's blood. It is very difficult to deal with. As long as it comes into contact with mud and rocks, it is almost immortal. It is normal that it does not die so easily. But the way these people summoned it is not right. It is very weak now and it is not a match for me in my current state. A slightly cold and neutral voice replied in the void. Chapter 11:15. Frederick is a monster born from the blood of Gaia's mother. As long as it comes into contact with soil and rocks, it will be immortal. It won't die so easily. However, these people summoned it in the wrong way. It's very weak and it's not my opponent at the moment. A slightly indifferent neutral voice replied in the void. The angel Aroma did not like to talk, but it did not mean that she could not speak. As a high-level creature with extraordinary wisdom, she understood every language in the world, whether the language came from the past, present, or future. This was the ability of comprehension, which only belonged to the gods, and it came from one of the basic laws of Babel Tower. Her voice was cold and slightly neutral, but it was not harsh. Instead, it made people feel comfortable and they could not help but want to hear her say more. Of course, Brando knew that this was impossible. Since Aroma was summoned, she had only said 3 sentences in total, and this was the 3rd sentence. The first 2 sentences were, "Answering your call, the promised one. Light be with Martha." Brando could understand all the meaning contained in Aroma's simple sentence. Frederick was not so easy to kill, but it was also strengthened a lot under the blessing of the loyalty card. It would not take much effort to deal with the former. He nodded but still reminded her, "But I have to remind you that the card can only last for 1 stage. There is still half an hour left, which means you have almost only 1 chance. You must make sure to kill it in 1 shot." Aroma nodded. Everyone could not see who Brando was talking to. If it were before, most of them would have thought that he was a lunatic talking to himself, but at this moment no one dared to think so. Even the girl with the thick eyebrows, who despised Brando the most, could not say anything bad at this moment. After all, the facts were right there. The big guy looked at the sword in Brando's hand in confusion, and he felt that the sword was a little familiar. He frowned, probably trying to associate this familiar sword with a certain identity. He thought that a sword was familiar to him mostly because the owner of the sword was a famous figure, and Brando's performance was enough to prove this point. However, the craftsmen of this era always liked to imitate famous swords, and the knight was also keen to use those fakes of legendary swords as if this was the only way to show off their identity. There were so many famous swords on the market that he could not think of a reason why. After all, he had been away from this circle for a long time. But what he didn't know was that not far behind him, the young follower had also seen the long sword that was made of dark golden metal shards. There were also dark red cracks on the surface of the long sword. The young believer seemed to be scalded and shouted, "Holy sword odorifies." What odorifies? The big knight turned his head subconsciously. At this time, Brando's figure had already disappeared. Everyone heard the scream and turned their heads. Although they were all born and raised in Cruz, they did not connect the holy sword odorifies with the flaming blade in their minds. But at this time, a faint light suddenly appeared in the sky, and then thousands of rays of light shot down from above the clouds. Everyone had to cover their eyes subconsciously, then squinted their eyes and looked in that direction. They saw countless lightning and flames, and a bright halo behind a pair of wings spread open. Such a scene was too familiar. The archangel was born from fire and lightning. She held a holy sword and slashed the evil god Frederick in the light and sea. This was the bedtime story that countless people grew up listening to. There were countless myths and legends in the Pale poem, but only this one was the source of pride in the hearts of the people of the empire. At the same time, it was also the symbol of the empire. The empire's eagle emblem originated from the holy emblem on the shield of the archangel Aroma. That's Aroma. Martha above, Lady Aroma has appeared. Almost subconsciously the people knelt down. But a few people suddenly realized that the place where Aroma appeared was the direction Brando was looking at before. That's the holy sword Odorfies. Finally, someone realized something and could not help but shout. It's the flaming blade. The big knight only felt a buzzing sound in his head. He finally understood why he felt that the sword was so familiar. The sword was so sacred and noble that every knight of the empire had to make a sacred oath to it. Oh my God! The people could not help but subconsciously connect everything they knew. Finally, the only possibility took root and grew in their hearts and made them feel helpless. His Majesty, the Flame King is back. The Flame King is back to save us. Amidst the fanatical emotions, the girl with the thick eyebrows only felt that it was unbelievable. Is he really the Flame King? She could not help but mutter to herself, Miss Priestess's Lord is His Majesty the Flame King? She felt a wave of dizziness. Andesha's face was as white as snow. She looked at the scene with a shocked expression. The entire street was turned into ashes by the attack just now. Such power was not something a mortal could control, and the strange phenomenon in the sky proved this point. She felt a chill in her heart. Could it be that this city was protected by Aroma as the people of Cruz claimed? Of course, she did not want to believe it, but other than that, there was no other way to explain the scene in front of her. She slightly bent her stiff knuckles and subconsciously retreated into the shadows. Although she was arrogant, she still knew her limits. How could a mortal interfere in a battle between gods? The archangel with the holy sword had descended to this world, and she had to inform the Dragon Queen of the situation here. Brando watched as the woman retreated into the alleyway. He dispelled his refraction spell and descended from the sky, following behind her without a word. He saw Andesha coming to a ruin. She pushed open a charred wooden beam and walked in. She walked through the ruins and quickly arrived at a narrow room. Although the room was already burnt beyond recognition, even the outer walls had collapsed. She nailed a vine to the ground and pulled it up, opening a secret door from the ground. Brando raised his eyebrows when he saw this scene. Ever since Alcra told him that the dark cultists had many secret passages, he had already expected that Andesha would use them. Otherwise, it would be difficult for her to appear and disappear in Rusta City with her strength. Andesha was not weak, but in the heart of the Empire's power, she could not do as she pleased. After opening the secret door, Andesha carefully looked around. She was mainly worried about the Archangel in the sky. Seeing that the Archangel did not chase after her, she cautiously let out a sigh of relief and prepared to walk down the secret passage. But at this moment she felt a slight chill on her neck. Odorfice's gleaming blade had appeared there. The beautiful woman's expression froze. She realized that she did not know how he got close to her. The answer was very simple for Brando. He had the monster leader template and could assimilate the senses of monsters. In the game, the dark cultists were considered as monsters, so this ability was also effective. We meet again, Lady Andesha. He opened his mouth and spoke. Andesha rolled her eyes and was about to say something when she saw the young man in front of her smiling and reaching out to grab her wrist. She was startled and subconsciously wanted to retreat, but she felt as if her hand was clamped by a pair of iron pincers and could not move. What made her even more shocked was that after her lines of law flickered, they completely disappeared. This discovery almost scared her out of her wits. She hurriedly sank her mind into the spiritual world, only to find that she could no longer feel any elemental power. What did you do to me? Andesha screamed in horror. She could not help but panic. Without the power of her element power, her strength had regressed to the level of a gold ranker or at most a little stronger. Brando smiled. This was the ability of spacetime control. He had only isolated Andesha from the spacetime around her. This isolation would not last more than a second for existences stronger than him, but for Andesha, it should not be a problem for him to maintain it for a few minutes. It was only after Brendel obtained this ability that he realized how terrifying his elemental essences were. These elemental essences were almost overwhelming to those who were on the same level as him. A few seconds of blank time was enough for him to kill any enemy. The only regret was that he needed to come into contact with the enemy before he could use this ability. However, this was not a particularly harsh requirement for a close combat job. Furthermore, element power was constantly strengthened. Who knew if this ability could be used from a distance in the future? Even though your intelligence is only below average among the 12 patriarchs, you often go back on your words. I have to be wary of you lying to me, which is why I used this method, Lady Andesha. Brando replied, I have only sealed your ability. As for whether you can take it back, that will depend on your attitude. How did you seal my ability? Andesha was terrified. She had completely forgotten how arrogant she was in the loop of trade winds. After losing her ability, she only had a few hundred years more experience than an ordinary person. However, such knowledge was obviously useless in the current situation. She had never heard of anything like what was happening to her body. Brando could hear something from her tone and laughed. It seems like that lady of yours is hiding a lot of things from you. She did not tell you what happened in the White Rose Garden. If I'm not wrong, you should not know about Iroma's descent, nor the reason for the Silver Queen's failure. Iroma's descent has something to do with you? Andesha looked at the young man in front of her with eyes full of fear. Of course I know that the Silver Queen will fail. Her failure is destined. Even the divine people could not do it back then, and she wants to reopen the Truth Symposium to do it? How laughable. But you did not tell her this, didn't you? You even lied to your allies. Brando shook his head. Also, I want to say that you do not know the reason for the Silver Queen's failure. She has already reopened the Truth Symposium. That's impossible. Andesha suddenly stopped talking. Brando could even hear her teeth chattering. You really are the Dark Dragon? You think too much, Lady Andesha. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He shook his head and replied, but my authority is higher than the Silver Queen's. Gwendolyn obviously knew this, but she did not tell you. It seems like your relationship with her is not closer than the Silver Queen's relationship with her. Perhaps the next one to be sold will be you, won't you? She has no obligation to tell us this in the first place. Then there's no need for you to sacrifice your life for her, is there? No. Andesha frowned and shook her head. If you want to kill me, I won't even bat an eyelid. But I can't ruin this plan. Brando was surprised to see a glimmer of idealism in this vicious woman's eyes. Even though he knew that the Tree Herders was an organization that split from the Ring of the World, and its predecessor was the Ring of Ashes, he thought that these people had already forgotten the pursuit of their predecessors. It was a pity that even if these people had other motives, their actions were still despicable. Brendel's expression turned cold, and the sword in his hand moved closer to Andesha's neck. Plan? What plan? Is it related to the Roman? It is related to that little girl. Andesha looked at him hatefully. But you can't save her. You can't save her. If you save her, everyone will die. Is that so? Then you better tell me everything. Brando threatened coldly. Don't even think of making me say half a word. Very well, I'll give you the count of 3. If you don't tell me, I'll have Iroma sacrifice herself and kill Frederick indiscriminately. I believe that you didn't spend so much effort to summon her to play hide and seek with me. No, you can't do that. Why would Iroma listen to your orders? Of course I can do that. Because I'm a planeswalker. I'm sure you've guessed it. Iroma was summoned by me. Even if she sacrifices herself, I can still revive her. Andesha's eyes were filled with fear and she almost begged, no, you can't do that. You'll kill everyone, and even if you do that, you won't be able to save your fiancée. You know that she's my fiancée. Brando was unmoved. I'll give you a chance to convince me. Before that, I'll count to 3. 3. 2. Chapter 11:16. I'll speak. Before Brando could finish his countdown, Andesha suddenly gritted her teeth and answered. Brando looked at her quietly, as if he wanted to see through the true thoughts of this woman who was famous for her craftiness, and the lies she was about to tell. You know the consequences of lying to me, and I don't want to repeat myself. If I doubt your words, I will immediately give the order to Iroma. Why you can't be so unreasonable? Andesha revealed her sharp white fangs, glaring at Brando angrily. Of course I can be so unreasonable. Brando impatiently interrupted her. The anxiety in his heart was beyond imagination, and he did not want to waste any more words. From now on, everything will be decided by me. Your answer must satisfy me, and I will decide the standard of my satisfaction. I don't care what you think, I'm just telling you the consequences. Andesha cleverly shut her mouth, and used her eyes to stare at Brando's face. If her eyes were 2 sharp swords, Brando's eyes would have been a hole. What is Dragon Queen Gwendolyn's plan? Brando asked. Lure the Twilight Dragon to descend and then kill it? Everything we do is to save this world. It's just that the people of this world don't understand. Any war requires sacrifice. I didn't ask you to finish your sentence. Brando mercilessly interrupted her. You're talking nonsense again. I didn't ask you to explain, and it seems like you don't quite understand. I'm a very impatient person and I have a very bad temper. Brando raised his head and looked at the sky. Iroma's soul was connected to his, and several golden pillars of light immediately descended from the dark sky, causing the streets to explode. The flashes of the explosions were reflected in the depths of Andesha's eyes, and she finally felt a deep sense of fear. Everyone thought that the tree herders were lunatics, but in her eyes, Brando was a complete lunatic. Moreover, the latter was completely unreasonable, as if he did not care about the life and death of this world. She stared at Brando's dark brown eyes in fear and saw that there was a demon living in them. Her nose was filled with the thick smell of blood from the other party's body, and her lips had lost some color and were even slightly pale. Why would the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn do that? Are you trying to say that she has a hobby of being a savior? This is not her idea alone. She is the leader of the tree herders. This plan is what the tree herders have been working for thousands of years. In the end, the high and mighty woman weakly added, "I'm telling the truth." Brando didn't appreciate it. "I didn't ask you if it's true or not. I have my own judgment. Are you stalling for time?" Andesha immediately shut her mouth and closed her eyes, feeling extremely humiliated. What are the details of this plan? What does it have to do with the Roman? After confirming that Andesha had completely submitted, Brando jumped to the question he was most concerned about. The Dusk Dragon's will is sealed in that little girl's soul. The Dragon Queen hopes to guide the Dusk Dragon to descend upon her body, and then completely defeat the Dusk Dragon. Kill the Dusk Dragon? What does she plan to do? In the past, the Dusk Dragon had always projected its will into Wond. We believe that once it materializes in this world, we will be able to find a chance to truly kill it, and thus completely end the confrontation between the civilization and the Dusk. With just you? The Dusk Dragon is powerful, but there is a limit to the power that its host in this world can withstand. Even if it doesn't care about the host's life and death, its power will not increase to the limit the moment it descends. Moreover, our thousands of years of preparation is not so simple. The tree herders have always been searching for the power in the blood of the gods, not to recreate the gods, but to use some kind of medium. Some kind of medium? A lost bloodline of the gods. It can be absorbed and purified by the gods, allowing the pure-blooded gods to have the same power and authority as their ancestors. In this way, if the Dusk Dragon wants to completely devour the little girl, it will have to face the highest authority in this world, which is equivalent to becoming the enemy of the Order and the law of Tiamat in Wond. Brando understood the tree herder's plan. The Dusk Dragon had always been the enemy of the Order and the law of Tiamat in Wond, but that was when it was at its peak. But according to Andesha, when it descended into this world, there would be a period of weakness, and during that time, the Dragon Queen would find a way to purify the bloodline of the Roman, forcing the Dusk Dragon to wage an all-out war against the Order and the law of Tiamat in its weakened state. That lost bloodline of the gods is the blood of the Dragon of Fury, Alphonse? You spent thousands of years planting trees in Wond just to find it? To find Gaia's blood. Gaia's blood? Brando narrowed his eyes and recalled Iroma's words. Frederick is a monster born from the blood of Gaia's mother. As long as it comes into contact with soil and rocks, it will never die. But these people summoned it the wrong way. It's very weak and it's not a match for me right now. But he clearly remembered that Frederick came from the twisted consciousness of the Dragon of Fury, Alphonse's blood. Besides, wasn't Gaia's blood also the descendants of the demon tree Finlidos, the evil god that the tree herders had researched the most? Andesha seemed to have seen through Brando's thoughts and replied, "The demon tree Finlidos has long since perished. We are called tree herders because we want to recreate this bloodline, but unfortunately we have all failed. The bloodline of the golden tree is too thin, and even calling it a divine messenger is too much. One of the reasons I went to the Loop of Trade Winds a year ago was to find the legendary Valhalla. We have always suspected that the demon tree Finlidos was originally a world tree." Brando finally understood that the tree herders had always known about Valhalla. But it was not strange when he thought about it. Valhalla was originally a stronghold on the same level as Babel. Andesha looked at Brando hatefully. "Unfortunately, you destroyed that opportunity, and we had no choice but to try the backup plan. Although Frederick was created from the blood of Alphonse, it also has a part of Gaia's blood in it. It was born from two types of divine blood. That means you have known about Frederick's existence for a long time, but why did you not act until now? We have always been looking for the legendary baby girl, the pure-blooded one created by the divine folk, the one with the will of the Twilight Dragon sleeping in her body. She is also your fiancée." "You're lying, you found that baby girl 60 years ago." "I'm not lying, don't turn around." Andesha hurriedly shouted, her voice full of grievance. The tree herders actually knew about the baby girl's final destination 130 years ago, but it was only 60 years ago that they had the chance to enter the final holy temple. But it was true that the Dragon Queen entered the final holy temple 60 years ago and saw the baby girl, but that was not the best time to bring her out. We had to avoid the attention of the Bugas and the dragons, and those mediocre people would not allow us to carry out such a crazy plan. You also know that this is a crazy plan. But it is effective. Whether it is effective or not is another matter. Let's continue with the previous question. You, Her Majesty, and my grandfather put on a show together and deceived everyone. Even if you spent 10 years, you have waited 60 years, 10 years more than half a century. This is not a period of time that can be passed in the blink of an eye. Compared to our grand plans, 60 years is just a blink of an eye. We have used thousands of years to reach this step. Because your entire plan is so long, you can leisurely give up 60 years of it? Of course not. The Dragon Queen has a purpose for this arrangement. Avoiding the eyes of the Bugas and the dragons is only one of them, and the other is the layout in the Empire, preparing for today's perfect ceremony. We still have some people all over the world looking for the whereabouts of the demon tree Finlitos. Frederick is only a last resort, it is only suitable for today's situation. We have prepared many sets of plans to ensure that nothing goes wrong. But it won't take 60 years. Everything is premeditated. When the Dragon Queen and us first came into contact with the Silver Queen, they were preparing for this day. She deliberately lured the Queen to release the baby girl's seal in order to borrow half of her soul to seal in the baby girl's body. Then we need to wait for her to grow up, and the two souls are completely merged. Although the little girl is not the Silver Queen, her soul and personality are deeply influenced by the Queen. So what? Because we need a pure and kind soul to carry the dark side of the baby girl. When she fuses with Frederick's bloodline, she will not be affected by the evil god's slaughter and chaotic desires. The Queen is the most suitable candidate, the Dragon Queen has chosen her from the beginning. Andesha's chest rose and fell slightly. When the disciples of the Black Flames completed the summoning ceremony, the Dragon Queen sacrificed the last soul, allowing the evil god Frederick to descend on her body. That person is the Silver Queen. The dark side of the Queen is now perfectly fused with Frederick, and when it meets the baby girl, the two will have the same soul. So they will fuse. They will not fuse on their own accord, but the Dragon Queen will urge it to happen. The pure bloodline of the baby girl will allow her to have the absolute initiative during the fusion process, and the pure kindness of the Silver Queen will suppress her dark side. In the process, the little girl will sublimate into an existence like the ancestors, and then fight against the will of the Twilight Dragon who is fighting for control of her body. In the process of materialization, the power of the Twilight Dragon is entrusted to Roman's body, but if it can't get this body in a short period of time, it's equivalent to cutting off the channel between itself and its power. Roman's body is like a cage trapping it inside. Is this your plan? Andesha looked at him blankly. You guessed it. I'm not a fool. Maybe you like to treat people as fools, but the Silver Queen trusted you and this is how you repay her? We don't need trust, we only need the plan to be executed perfectly, and there will always be sacrifices. Shut up, Brando coldly interrupted her. If the Silver Queen is willing, then this is a sacrifice. But now I only see deception and use. You have turned her life's work and dreams into a laughable joke. You trample on the dignity and lives of others and you call yourself saviors? But if we succeed, you will not succeed. Brando replied mercilessly. Andesha's eyes were filled with anger. Brando looked at her with a little pity, but there was no sympathy. The matriarch of the tree herders struggled violently as if she had been greatly insulted, almost breaking free from Brando's hand. The flaming edge of the blade of fire left several bloody marks on her snow-white neck, but she did not seem to feel it. Two dazzling pillars of light fell from the dark sky, and Andesha let out a whimper like an injured beast. Stop, she shouted. I was wrong, stop. How does the Dragon Queen plan to kill the Twilight Dragon? Brando asked coldly. The gods left the final authority in this world, and that is our last hope. As long as the Twilight Dragon is imprisoned in that little girl's body, Gwendolyn will activate that authority and kill the Twilight Dragon's physical body in this world. Andesha shouted loudly. What will happen to the Roman after that? Brando looked at the woman and asked one last question. Andesha opened her mouth but no sound came out. Seeing this scene, Brando knew that he did not need an answer. He threw Andesha forward, and the latter crashed into the ruins with a bang, letting out a miserable scream. Brando slowly raised the flaming edge and walked through the ruins. Andesha trembled as she climbed up from the broken bricks, the cold tip of the sword already pressed against her forehead. Brando looked at the woman coldly. Where is the Dragon Queen and the Roman? Kill me, the matriarch closed her eyes, trembling as she screamed, kill me and I won't tell you. I won't kill you but I will kill Frederick. Brando replied. Andesha opened her eyes and her eyes were filled with hatred. You can't do that. You will destroy our only hope, our only hope. You have already destroyed the hope of countless people. Look at this city and the thousands of people who died in this war. If we don't do that, they will still die. Chapter 11:17. But they will still die. Andesha shouted. Brendel looked at her with disdain, dismissing her words. Of course they won't die. He shook his head and exposed her mercilessly. I know that the gods have more than one plan. You don't have to lie to me. The Ring of Ashes has always been stubborn. Everything you've done is just to prove that you're right. As for whether you're right, you're not sure, are you? So, for the sake of your experiment, you've involved countless people who don't know the truth. Don't make your selfish desire sound so righteous. But we might succeed. I might succeed too. Brando revealed a rare cold smile that sent chills down Andesha's spine. Let me tell you a piece of good news. Since you have angered me, I have decided to join the game. Now, the game will be played according to my rules. What are you trying to do? Andesha stared at him as if she was looking at a madman. To prove that you are wrong and I am right, I will first make you accept your failure. Brando replied. No, you can't do that. Do you feel that it is unfair? Brando shook his head. Those who were killed by you and the Silver Queen felt the same way. But I will do what you have done. Andesha finally broke down. She slumped down as if she had lost all her strength. All right, I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything, but please at least give us a chance. Andesha spoke in a tone that even she could not believe. Brando did not say a word. He could not make such a promise. He only had one goal, and that was to let the Roman live. Perhaps it was selfish. But he did not think that he was noble. If the world had to let some people die in order to let others live, then he would rather fight until the last moment than compromise. Death and destruction were not to be feared. What was terrifying was the loss of faith and perseverance. The flames of civilization were passed down from generation to generation in such glory. Perhaps one day, people would be proud of such a history instead of living in pain and regret. Brando remained silent for a long time, waiting for Andesha's reply. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, but it felt like a century had passed before Andesha spoke with a dry voice. Actually, it's useless even if I tell you because you won't be able to find them. The Dragon Empress will lead the little girl to the Earth Elemental Plane, where the elemental barrier is the weakest. She's a gold person and a dragon whose blood has been purified. That's why she can elementalize and enter the elemental barrier. It's impossible for ordinary people to reach there. Andesha suddenly stopped talking. She saw Brando opening a dimensional hole and pulling out a sword. The sword was as gray as a stone. The blade was as wide as a palm and 2 inches thick. There was a saying inscribed on the blade. The one who wields this sword is the innate master of the earth. The ancient English grammar was concise and powerful. Dozens of characters were written in Gutenberg's script in an unusually simple and heavy style. They were connected to each other as if they contained magical power. Brando kissed the blade like a real knight and said softly, "Old friend, please guide me for the last time. Perhaps you still remember the glory of 1,000 years ago. I'm proud to be able to fight alongside you." As he spoke, he threw his sword forward. You. Andesha felt as if there was a thorn stuck in her throat. Haurangaya let out a soft whimper. It had been sleeping for thousands of years, and the fierce battles had left merciless scars on its blade. It was no longer as glorious as it used to be. It used to control the entire land, because the one who wields this sword is the king of the earth. But the wind and frost had passed and time flew by. When it reappeared in the world, it had accompanied an ordinary knight from a border kingdom through many roads. Its enemies were no longer great and eternal existences, but the faith on the sword had never faded. It was the Haurangaya. The elemental laws of the entire world resonated with it. This was the sound of a holy sword. The Haurangaya suddenly broke apart, and the fragments formed a door of light that floated in the air. Clouds swirled around the door, forming a huge vortex. Andesha looked up at this shocking scene and saw a mountain peak hanging down from the sky. The peak of the Spiral Mountain. Legend had it that it was reflected on the White Tower and opposed to the White Tower. Then this place was... Andesha looked at the other side of the door, and her dark eyes reflected a breathtakingly beautiful scenery. It was a shallow sea with waves as smooth as a mirror. Clouds floated in the sky, and at the end of the line between the sea and the sky, a towering mountain stood alone. New life and death, endless growth. This was the world outside the elemental barrier. Shallow sea. The elemental plane of water. The door of light formed by the Howran Gaia rotated slightly, and gray threads of law fell from it and turned into dust. The fragments of the sword became dimmer and dimmer, like the gaze of an old hero. It had seen many sceneries and its footprints were all over the wound. It was once held in the hands of the most heroic person in the world. It was the sword of swords, the holy sword of Gaia. But this was the last thing it saw. Gaia's teachings came from the belief of protection. Nobles protected their citizens, priests protected their believers, fathers protected their families, and mothers protected their children. At this moment, it acknowledged Brando's protection. This was the noblest tribute. A few lines of law landed on Brendel's body, and with a flash they merged into his body. Brando was stunned for a moment. He discovered that there was an additional description of the earth element in his elemental power. He looked up at the door of light and roughly understood what was going on. The power of inheritance. The Howran Gaia has acknowledged you. A white fox landed beside Brando's feet. She was a little dirty and had a few wounds on her body, but her black eyes were bright. Feel its law well. Perhaps one day you will really become the king of the world. I will. Brando replied. White mist, what happened to the Roman? It is similar to what you understand. Because of Gaia's aura, the soul of the twilight dragon in the Roman's body went berserk. It has not fully descended yet, but the dragon empress will definitely guide it to happen. White mist stared at the other side of the door of light. My power is not enough to stop her, and neither are you. But perhaps we can work together. The shallow sea is the entrance to the elemental barrier. I have been to this world a few times and I can guide you. If I kill Frederick, what will happen? You can't kill it. Andesha grabbed the blade of his sword in agitation. Blood flowed from her white fingers, but she did not seem to notice it as she shouted, You promised me. Brendel ignored her and continued to look at the white fog. White Mist shook her head. Have you ever thought that even if you kill Frederick, the Twilight Dragon will still descend upon the Roman? At that time the Roman Empire will cease to exist. Brando fell silent. Andesha also trembled and did not dare to make a sound. You already knew this? He suddenly asked. Do you blame me? No. Brando shook his head. He knew that even if he knew that the Twilight Dragon's will was in the Roman's body, it would still be futile. It was the first time he felt so lost about the future. He thought about the moonlit summer night in Bucci. He thought about everything about the merchant girl. He thought about her amusing leather skirt, her bag, her smooth forehead, and her bright and cunning eyes. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Brando, no matter what you do, I will stand by your side. Brando, I will become a great merchant in the future. You will. He muttered to himself, no matter who you are, I will save you. I promised you. You really look like that idiot Odin now. White Mist suddenly said. Brando shook his head. No, I don't look like him at all. What? Because he failed and I will succeed. I hope so. The man and the fox stepped into the world behind the gate of light, leaving Andesha to stare blankly at the gate of light. The gate of light gradually faded, and the scenery behind it became more and more illusory. But the tree herder's leader suddenly gritted her teeth and rushed in with her hands covered in blood. The gate of light flickered behind her and disappeared. About a few minutes later, Pamela limped over. She looked left and right all the way to the place where the door of light had disappeared. She sniffed lightly with her nose and finally sighed. I'm a step too late, my lord. The shallow sea. Among the many worlds of Vaunt, such a word was called Torrigon by the witches, and the dwarves called it the world of the water of all things. It was the home of the elven tree and also the home of the elves. It was recorded in the Pale poem as a mysterious rune that was difficult to decipher with the wisdom of mortals, but humans gave it a definition, the elemental plane of water. Many people dreamed of the shallow sea because it was connected to the river of abyss. It was the place where the fate of mortals rose and fell. In that dream, it was a boundless blue sea with grayish-white promontories rising from the sea, forming a cliff-like scene. It formed a path that led straight to the mountain of storm cessation. At the peak of the mountain, wind elemental dragons and wind elemental dragons circled around all year round. Their breaths formed storms that patrolled the entire continent. Under the mountains, earth elemental energy gathered and formed the last barrier of the elemental barrier. Here the mountains were suspended in the void. Rock-boring worms often dug through the elemental barrier, causing magic to invade and form monster nests or monster swarms in the wound. This was the center of the earth elemental energy, the stone plane. Brando saw that the endless grayish-white path was now full of traces of battle. The bodies of giant wolves were scattered on the rocks, and crystal fragments were shattered on the ground. In the distance there was a huge corpse lying on the side of the road. It was a crystal giant, but there was only a hole where its head should have been. This was the shallow sea. The origin of all life, a world that was endlessly born and destroyed. He looked up and saw the sacred spiral mountain and the mountain of storm cessation standing face to face on the white plain under the clouds. He suddenly felt sad. The Howran Gaia had witnessed many things that he had done in this world. Everything started with the ABs, the battles, the adventures, the prosperity of the territory, the expectations on everyone's faces, and the smile of Romaine. But they all turned into fragments and disappeared with the wind. Did you remember something from the past? White Mist suddenly asked. How did you know? Brando looked at the little fox in surprise. The shallow sea is the origin of all life. The dying can see their lives here. The memories of mortals, wisdom, and spirituality float in the sea. Water is born from life, and fire gives it wisdom. Brando looked around and found that between the corpses of the giant wolves and the crystal, broken grayish-white rocks rose into the sky. They were suspended in the air as if invisible magic was holding them up. The air was buzzing and the wind blew across the sky. The clouds were spreading in a certain direction at a speed visible to the naked eye. The center and source of the magic flow obviously came from the direction of the mountain of storm cessation. He looked up and squinted his eyes. What's going on? My lord's ritual has begun. The twilight dragon is descending, and the power of chaos will break through the elemental barrier in a short period of time. That's why the shallow sea has such violent magic fluctuations. A voice came from behind them. It was Andesha. The matriarch of the tree herders clenched her fist and answered with gritted teeth. This change is not too far in the shallow sea, but in the Wonde, the largest magic tide in 1,000 years has already arrived. It can be seen first in the Great Glacier and White Mountain, but it will soon sweep across the entire continent. Brando looked at the woman, and a voice echoed in his heart. The era of war and chaos has begun. P.S. Blackie came to play here yesterday and went out to receive this newbie, so I didn't update. I came back today to make up for it. Speaking of which, I saw the battle between the Warship Maiden in the afternoon finally come to an end. It's really gratifying. It's really a battle between gods, and the players are the ones who suffer. That's why I said we'll see each other in the game. Chapter 11:18. The shallow sea is the first barrier between the elemental barrier and the real world. This is the world of the water elemental. The nature of the water elemental is both stable and lively. It is not as active as the fire elemental, nor as stable as the earth elemental, nor as changeable as the wind elemental. It nurtures changes in tranquility, and is neither static nor unstable. That is why it can sustain life. White Fog's eyes reflected the scenery of the sea and the sky. Clouds floated above her eyelids like mist. She stretched out her claws and pointed forward with her long nails. The grayish-white path extended from her fingertips until it disappeared below the sea's surface. The grayish-white promontory is one of the most magnificent sights in the shallow sea. It is endless, and the end is connected to the wind elemental plane. But if we want to reach the mountain of ceasing storms, we can't just walk down this path. This path leads to an endless world, and its length is also endless. Then what should we do? Brando tapped the ground with the flaming edge. The grayish-white promontory responded with a rock-like sensation, but the flaming edge still could not leave a mark on it. Andesha followed behind him in silence, occasionally looking at him with pity. Sometimes she would show disdain or even hatred, but most of the time she was expressionless and silent. White Fog tapped the ground with her claws and said, "In the shallow sea, there is no substance other than the water elemental. The clouds and sky we see, including this grayish-white promontory, are all made of the water elemental." The water elemental? He bent down and touched the surface of the ground. The rocky surface was rough and cold, and there was even a fine layer of sand. It was just like the headlands he saw in Trendheim and the Sublime Sea. Other than the lack of bird nests and gastropod shellfish between the cracks, there was nothing different about it. You can't feel the difference? White Fog saw his action and replied, "This is normal. Our world is made of the elements, and the elemental world is based on the spirit. The grayish-white promontory is just something we imagined, but it was recorded in legends and myths for thousands of years, and naturally projected into this world. On the other hand, the mountain of ceasing storms and the river of scorching heat do not exist because we believe that the wind elemental plane and the fire elemental plane should be like this. It has accumulated over time in the secular world to form the scene we see today. It wagged its long tail, and its voice was unusually ethereal. To cross White Cape, it's best to have the natives lead the way. Another way is to get the sea fog lamp. The light will pierce through all the fog and guide us to the other side. Sea mist lamp? How do I get that? Brando asked casually. When we get close to the Mirror Coast, I will find a way to attract the lighthouse fish. The sea fog lamp grows on these fish. When the time comes, you can defeat one of them and get the sea fog lamp. Then you can summon the extraditor. It will take us through the shallow sea and reach the storm-stop mountain. Mirror Coast. It was Brando's first time outside the elemental barrier. Everything in this strange world was unfamiliar to him. The shallow sea is not static. Some places are calm, and the bottom of the sea is so clear that you can even see the bedrock made up of the foundation of the world. But some places are full of fog and sharp-edged cliffs protrude from the bottom of the sea, covering the entire sea. There are all kinds of elemental creatures lurking under the cliffs. The lighthouse fish is just one of them. There are also the Tiramosis, who are a very strange kind of human. They have a special ability to weave light into a path of light and guide their ships to sail in the fog. The Tiramosis are the best extraditors. White Fog scratched the ground with her claws and replied as she recalled, "The lighthouse fish are a bit like a large anglerfish. You will understand when you see them. They live by devouring light and are the greatest enemy of the Tiramosis. However, the light in the sacs on top of their heads is the purest light element. This is also the only external element in the shallow sea. It is the sacred item of the Tiramosis. If you have the chance to find a Tiramosis tribe, you might be able to participate in their trade. The Tiramosis rely on light to travel between different planes. They have many good things. Back then, the Witch Empress obtained a spring of youth from them." A spring of youth. Andesha's hoarse voice came from behind. She muttered to herself, "I have never heard of the Tiramosis. They actually have a treasure like the spring of youth and are willing to exchange it. Doesn't that mean they are richer than giant dragons?" "What are giant dragons?" White Fog replied bluntly, "The Tiramosis are nobler elemental creatures. However, they are not the noblest among the elemental creatures. The noblest are the light people of Ruka. The light fairies are their kin in ancient times. The light people are the builders of Babel Tower. Very few people know this." "Aren't they the divine people?" "Even in the most glorious era, there were no more than 1,000 divine people. How could they do everything personally? The golden people are the warriors of the gods, and the elemental creatures are the craftsmen and artists. How can the enemies of the former be compared to the enemies of the latter?" Andesha looked at White Fog with a doubtful gaze. "How do you know so much? Who are you, Your Excellency?" White Fog turned around and glanced at her. "The decay of the previous generation was not as stupid as you. Decay refers to the degradation of all things. It is a part of the cycle of the world. It does not mean that all things will eventually die. As long as there is light and water, there will be new sprouts in the rotten soil. If you can't even understand such a simple principle, your achievements will stop here." Andesha stared at White Fog as if she was possessed. She was cunning by nature but not smart. Or rather, going back on her words was a way for her to protect herself. She was also very clear about her disadvantage among the 12 patriarchs. That was why she valued her unfathomable thoughts. But White Fog's words were like a sharp sword that pierced into her heart. Although it hurt her self-esteem, it seemed to have opened a path for her in the darkness. She stood there in a daze recalling those words. Brando and White Fog were not in the mood to wait for her. The two of them walked away for a while. Brando looked at the world of water elemental creatures. It was a vast sea with no end in sight. White Cape's jagged cliffs intersected with the waves crashing against the reefs. Lonely clouds and faint shadows hung under the blue sky. This was a unique and beautiful world. He seemed to hear that voice again. It was a somewhat low sigh. "Human, you have never seen the shallow seas. You will not understand how great nature is." And now he finally saw the ebb and flow of this world. The ebb and flow of the tides was magnificent, just like a painting. "How long will it take us to find the Termosian, White Fog?" Brando asked. "Are you afraid that we won't make it in time?" White Fog asked. "I don't know how the Dragon Queen reached the center, but it will take us a long time to get there. According to Andesha, her ritual has already begun." Brando said worriedly. "But when we arrive, her ritual will have just begun." White Fog replied confidently. What do you mean? White Fog raised her head and sniffed. What we call time is the law set down by Lady Martha. But here, outside the elemental boundary, there is no law of time. There are only remnants of the law of time from the prime material plane, but it does not play a major role. It is meaningless to the natives. Only creatures of order like us can use it. Brendel was stunned when he heard that. I don't quite understand. It's normal that you don't understand. Because you still have the logic of time in your mind, the law of time is useful to us. For beings without this logic, it is ineffective here. You can understand it this way. In the eyes of the Termosians, time is eternally still. When we come into contact with them, time will also become relatively slow, or even infinitely close to being still. So you don't have to worry about time. Doesn't that mean that as long as I stay with the Termosians forever, the Dragon Queen's ritual will never be completed? That's just your imagination. Suppose the world is about to be destroyed, but if you stop time from flowing 1 second before the destruction, does that mean the world will never be destroyed? Brando finally understood and nodded thoughtfully. Then maybe we can find a Termosian guide? The Termosians rarely enter the wind elemental plane. The elemental changes there are too active, and it's too dangerous for pure elemental creatures who don't live in that world. Besides, what's the use of bringing them along? It's nothing more than saving a little time on the road. When you meet the Dragon Queen, as long as she gets close to the Termosians, won't the state of time return to the same state? White Mist shook her head. So if you want to use the Termosians to deal with the Dragon Queen and the Twilight Dragon, you'd better not think about it. Andesha caught up with them at this time, but this time she did not speak. She just listened to the conversation silently. Brando finally had the idea of looking for the Termosians in his mind. Putting aside the question of whether or not he could participate in the trade fair with the Termosians, even if he got the sea mist lamp, he would still need to find an extraditer. Although the sea mist lamp itself could guide them out of the shallow sea, the extraditer would always save them some time. How can we reach the Mirror Coast and find the Termosians? He asked. Just walk, White Mist replied. But if there are natives leading the way, it'll be even faster. Brando thought for a moment and his mind sank into the world of thoughts. A card loomed in the darkness. He reached out to grab the card and heard Medish's puzzled voice. My lord. But he steeled his heart and did not answer. He held the card in his hand. The card was painted with a white deer, and on its back sat a fairy playing a flute. Song of Samsara Eternal Song Vi Light 4 Dark 4. Spell, pay 40 mana, night, summon Malurcha the white deer, level, Fahrenheit level -10, into the field. When the white deer leaves the field, choose 2 cards from the graveyard and shuffle them into the holder's deck. Maintain, Malurcha the white deer will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. Birth and death, endlessly growing and multiplying. Brando displayed the card and a glittering crystal stag stepped out of the door of light. It was tall and majestic and its eyes were clear and bright. From its neck to its chest, every muscle seemed to contain endless power. This was a male stag in the prime of his life. It was experiencing the most glorious period of its life. Malurcha's 4 slender hooves clattered on the gray headland. It raised its head and looked around. There was a very human light in its eyes and 2 drops of tears fell. I never thought I would be able to return to my homeland in my lifetime. It let out a long sigh, and its voice sounded directly in the hearts of everyone present. Is this the shallow sea? The little fairy pinned the flute to its waist and climbed up Malurcha's mane to the top of its head. It grabbed the antlers of the latter with one hand and put the other hand on its eyebrows. It looked as if it was looking into the distance at the horizon. It's so beautiful. It's much bigger than our lake. This little fairy wasn't any different from when Brando first saw it. Instead, its face was much fatter. God knew how much it had eaten in his world. This is your homeland, Malurcha? Brando asked. This is my homeland, Sir Lord, Malurcha answered, its tone full of humility and respect. It's exactly the same as when I left. I've often seen it in my dreams for thousands of years. Unfortunately, I can't keep you here, Malurcha. Travelers can't stop either, Sir Lord. This isn't something to be sad about. To be able to return to my homeland one day is already the greatest fortune for me. It shook its fur and answered, Sir, what orders do you have for summoning me? But right now, I'm just a mount in this card. The main body of this card is actually Lady Myasai. Lady Myasai? That's me. The little fairy pointed at herself proudly and answered, Lady Myasai is amazing. I can play the flute. When bad people hear my flute, they'll lose their minds. If Sir Lord hears my flute, he'll become even more powerful. Brando thought to himself, so you're a bard. The little fairy shook its head from side to side again and looked around. "Where's that fierce woman?" "She's not here," Brando answered. "Oh." The little fairy was both relieved and regretful. No one knew what she was thinking. Then her eyes turned. She had obviously thought of another interesting idea. In fact, if each star in the sky was used to represent an interesting idea in a fairy's mind, then the stars in the entire summer night would probably only be a third of the number. Chapter 11:19. Brando knew that the fairies' interests could be broader than the stars in the sky. Their topics could be longer than the holy river of the elves that flowed within St. Tassel, and they were just as talkative. If their curiosity was piqued, they could talk for 3 days and 3 nights. This was a big problem that was no less troublesome than nightfall. Brando saw that the little fairy was about to speak again, so he quickly took out a honey ball from his pouch and stuffed it into her mouth with 3 fingers. The little fairy instantly widened her eyes and whimpered in protest, but the honey melted as soon as it entered her mouth. She quickly closed her eyes in comfort, like a cat that had its head stroked. Is there more?" she asked in a muffled voice. "Enough for you to eat from morning to night, but if you don't eat quickly they'll all melt," Brando answered. These sweets were originally Roman snacks, and most of them had been stolen from the little fat dragon Sheeta. In order to satisfy the little fat dragon's request, Brando had opened a sugar factory in Tanajul, and the merchant girl had unceremoniously given him half of the shares. These shares weren't gold coins but half of the production. He still remembered the scene of the little fat dragon crying and coming to him for justice, only to be chased out by Hippamera. From this, it could be seen that the evils brought upon themselves were the hardest to bear. The little fairy believed Brando's words and quickly ate faster. Unfortunately, her teeth were small and white, and she couldn't eat much in one bite. She could only use her small tongue to lick around the giant candy ball. Fortunately, this was the simple happiness of fairies. She quickly became so engrossed in it that she forgot about everything else. However, the way she occasionally reached out her little palm and sucked all the honey off her 5 fingers was really unsightly. Malurcha shook his mane and let the little fairy slide from the top of his head to his back. It looked like he was also afraid that this little guy would get the honey on his head. A crystal stag. White Mist tilted her head and looked at Malurcha. She praised, "They are elemental creatures that live in the shallow seas. I didn't think you had a summon like this." Andesha looked at the scene of Brando summoning Malurcha with some reverence. She didn't know much about planeswalkers, but the less she knew, the more she feared this powerful and mysterious power. "Can Malurcha lead us to the Termosian?" Brando asked. "Of course," White Fog answered affirmatively. "They are the best guides in the mist. Some Termosians maintain good relations with the crystal stag. They believe that the crystal stag brings good luck." "Then can it take us directly to the mountain of ceasing storms?" Bai Wu shook her head and said, "I don't know. I've only been here 2 or 3 times with the Witch Empress." Brando then turned to Malurcha and said, "We need to find the Termosians. Malurcha, do you have a way to find them?" The tall stag nodded. "My lord, I know where they will appear. The Termosians hunt for elite seals in the Mist Sea near the Mirror Coast. However, they don't appear every day. If we are lucky, they will leave a path of light there. Through the path of light through the mist, we can find the Termosians' route. Don't the Termosians have a fixed foothold? They are the people of the sea. They have large fleets. These fleets move along the path of light, only stopping occasionally on floating ice or islands." He paused. "Actually, my lord, I am not the best guide to find the Termosians. Miss Mayasai is." "Her?" Brando turned to look at the little fairy lying on Malurcha's back. The latter was fighting with the sugar ball in her hand and had no time to care about anything else. The fairies have a good relationship with the Termosians. The Termosians are full of reverence for the elemental lord. The fairies are the darlings of the elemental plane. The Termosians think of them as oracles. Sometimes there are many fairies on the Termosian ships." Malurcha answered, "The fairies can always find the Termosians. The light boats they weave can pass through the path of light directly and reach the Termosians' foothold." Brando reached out and tapped the little fairy's head. "Malurcha, can you find the way to the mountain of ceasing storms?" "White Point can lead to the mountain of ceasing storms, my lord. However, we have to pass through the sea of floating ice. There is a group of killer whales blocking the sea. Only the Termosians can go around them." "It's just a group of killer whales?" "Those are elemental whales. I advise you not to imagine their size," White Mist answered. "I was lucky enough to see them once. It was a young whale. When it came out of the sea fog, it happened to be on the left side of our fleet. Its eyes alone were bigger than our entire fleet. Fortunately, this little guy was not interested in us and quickly left with its mother. This lady is right, Malucha answered. Brando was a little lost in thought. Could such a big whale still be called a killer whale? Although the size of a body could not truly reflect the strength of a creature, it could at least show how strong its physical strength was. A creature that could grow to such a size, was it not born with a perfect body? Was there such an existence in this world? He looked at the little fairy. She can weave a light boat? Although it did not look like it. The little fairy, Mayasai, frowned and shook her head to avoid his fingers. She answered in a muffled voice, "Of course not. I need many sisters to weave a light boat. I can't do it alone. But I know how to call them. If I ask, they will definitely come to help." She glanced at Brando. "We fairies are not like you humans. You ask for something in return for everything you do. My sister told me that you humans are all evil, but I still fell for it and was sealed into a card by you. Didn't your sister tell you that you were the one who barged in on your own?" Brendel looked at her exasperatedly. "That was to save Master Malucha. Did I ask for it? That's not it." The little fairy shook her head like a rattle drum. "But the candy you gave was delicious. Much better than honey." "My candy is not delicious at all. It's a candy for evil people. My sister said that there is no difference between good and bad candy, but the person who gives the candy is good and bad." Mayasai was very reasonable. Brando could not help but be conquered by her simple dialectical view. He was momentarily speechless. "Very good. I'm an evil person. I don't plan on giving you any more candy." He did not expect the little fairy to hug the candy ball and start sobbing before he could finish his sentence. Moreover, the more she cried, the sadder she became. Gradually, she showed signs of bawling. Brendel suddenly felt a sense of guilt, as if he had snatched a Lolita's lollipop and made her cry. He knew that the fairies were simple and not very smart, but he did not expect them to cry so sadly over such a small matter. "Don't cry," he said quickly. "I was just joking." "Really?" The little fairy stopped crying and looked at him with teary eyes. Brando felt a headache coming on and quickly nodded. "But you have to call your sisters because I need a light boat to find the Termosian. Miss Mayasai, my fiancé, is in the wrong hands. I'm very anxious, so the sooner the better, okay? Then do I have candy to eat?" "Of course. Not only you, but I'll also give your sisters a reward." Brando was not stingy with this kind of no-cost deal. Moreover, these candies belonged to Sheeta and the Roman. The little fairy rolled her eyes. "That's not necessary. Actually, they don't like candy. Just give me their share." As soon as she finished speaking, an angry voice rang out in the air. "Mayasai, you've been corrupted by the anthropologist." Brendel looked up in shock. He didn't know when, but a fairy in a sparkling dress was floating in the air. 4 pairs of wings as thin as cicadas' wings were fluttering up and down. She was staring at Mayath, who was lying on Malucha's back, with furrowed brows and vertical eyes. Fairies were born with a name and knew every fairy's name from birth. Their names were never repeated. Scholars had been puzzled by this for thousands of years, but they still could not figure it out. Then fairies appeared in the air one after another. They wore different clothes and looked like they were made of ice crystals. Their hair was also different. Some of them had even weirder hairstyles than the latest trends Brando had seen in the future. However, fairies were naturally lively. They pursued individuality. Every fairy wanted to be different. Mayasai was shocked. She quickly hugged her sugar ball tightly and stared at her sisters in the air. She called out their names one by one. "Futa, Thumb, why are you here?" Those who did not know might think that she was born and grew up here, but in fact, Mayasai had never seen her brethren before. It was just that fairies were born to know each other, even if they had never met before. This did not make sense, but it was a fact in Wond. "Humph." The fairies flying in the air stared at Mayasai and replied, "There's a battle here. Her Majesty the Queen asked us to come and take a look." As she said this, her eyes kept glancing at the sugar ball in Mayasai's hand. It was really suspicious of the fairy's real purpose. "This is mine." Mayasai quickly declared her ownership. "Fairies," Brando said, "you heard it just now. We need a light boat. If you're willing to help me, I don't mind exchanging honey with you." "I know how to weave a light boat too." Mayasai quickly jumped up. "You don't have to ask them for help. You can't do it alone." The fairies chattered. "Many people are needed to weave a light boat. All of us have to participate. Can you give each of us a reward?" The leader of the fairies asked. "1 candy each." The other fairies actually sang in unison. "2 for each," Brando replied. "2 for each," the fairies sang joyfully. That's my candy. Mayasai was very sad, but she quickly regained her spirit and said, I want to weave a light boat too. Then I'll give you 3, Miss Mayasai. Brando secretly told her through the telepathic link. Mayasai immediately smiled and looked at Brando with a kind gaze. At this moment she felt that her lord was the best human in the world. It seemed that her sister's words were not entirely correct. Andesha looked at the exchange with her mouth agape. The elemental world was in turmoil. Rocks rumbled down from White Cape, and then were lifted up into the sky by invisible magic. There seemed to be an upheaval in the direction of the mountain of ceasing storms, and this upheaval would affect the entire world through the elemental plane. It might even completely change the original appearance of this world. But the fairies, who had been promised happiness, turned a blind eye to this. As they worked, they even sang, the fairies' ship, beautiful and exquisite, is like a floating light like a star. The fairies' ship, light and small. It passes through the clouds and through the straits. The elemental world was the fairies' home. If the shallow sea was destroyed by the arrival of dusk, then they might lose their home. But the fairies' seemingly heartless optimism made Brando sigh. He looked up at the fairies forming a circle in the air. The elemental stars gathered in their hands, forming threads of bright light. Then they gathered together and quickly formed the outline of a ship. At first, he was worried that the ship made by the fairies would be a pocket-sized boat only suitable for them. But he quickly calmed down. Although the ship was not big, only the size of a sampan, it was at least enough for him and Malurcha. At this time he remembered the previous topic and suddenly turned to White Mist. Why are they called killer whales? Isn't there a species with the same name in the material world? White Mist was stunned for a moment before replying, because that's what the Termosai call them. When it's hunting season they will even hunt whales. They can hunt those whales? Brendel was a little surprised. How strong would the Termosian be if they could hunt those whales? That's their secret. White Mist seemed to have read his mind and explained, they're not that strong. They're just born with the power of the elemental realm. They're not that strong. They're just born with the power of the elemental realm. Brando muttered to himself. He finally realized that what he saw was actually just a corner of the world. Then will there be a sage in the Termosai tribe? Chapter 11:20. The Termosai have a long lifespan, but most of them can't live through childhood and adulthood. Like other elemental creatures, a disease caused by magic erosion spreads among them, causing great trouble to the tribe. Moreover, the Termosai will regularly sail beyond the elemental barrier to hunt in the chaos. Adults and young individuals often die in the long-term hunting. A few individuals with a long lifespan will become shamans or wise men, guiding the future direction of the clan and tribe. The light ship sailed in the fog. The light from the ship broke through the fog, illuminating a dozen meters ahead. The water was dark like a mirror. The mirror reflected a steel cable that seemed to have turned white under the high temperature, but it was actually a fluorescent beam of light. It passed through the fog from the left side of the ship, shot out from an unknown place behind the fog, and disappeared into the churning fog in front of it. That was the light path of the Termosai. To ordinary people it was just a beacon made purely of the elemental law of light, but the fairies and Termosai could use it to teleport to many different worlds. White Mist stood at the bow of the ship, her dark eyes reflecting the fog and light, looking both dense and sparkling. The light ship of the fairies was a little like the boat of the elves. It was flat and long like a leaf with a long leaf stalk extending from the stem. A lantern hung on it, but there was no fire in the crystal lamp, only floating light as if a group of fireflies were trapped in it. She stood above the lantern, her claws tightly grasping the leaf stalk, standing steadily and said, "Most of these elders have the power of the sage realm, but for the Termosai, such wise men are very rare. Usually there are only 1 or 2 in most clans." "Only 1 or 2 elders in each clan?" Brando asked, puzzled. This was a race that was born with elemental grade. Even the dragons would have more than 1 or 2 sages, right? He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He asked this question because of the sage realm and the perfect body, especially the latter was also an unsolved mystery in the game. The players relied on the war slate to achieve the silver body, but it was a trick after all. However, although many people wanted to find a more perfect way, there were too few records of the perfect body in the game. According to the official statement, it was the path to becoming a god, and it was not so easy to achieve. The players once hoped to find hope outside the wound. After all, everyone knew that there were many powerful and strange races outside the elemental barrier. Many of them had the power of gods, but how many could really reach the elemental barrier? The players went to the fire elemental plane, but that was only a dungeon quest. Now that he finally had the chance to touch this world, he naturally did not want to waste this opportunity. However, he did not expect the white mist's answer to disappoint him. How can the path of the sage be so easy to walk? It is even more so for elemental creatures. Most elemental creatures can never set foot in the realm of gods because they lack the power of blood. This is the case for the Termosai. But the real meaning of the existence of the elders of the Termosai is not their strength, but their wisdom. The elders are the lights of every clan and tribe. For the Termosai, the sage is like a big book full of wisdom. The Termosai themselves do not have a written language. They pass on knowledge through knots and oral communication. Sometimes, the accidental death of an elder means the loss of inheritance, or even the survival of a tribe. So you must maintain the necessary respect when facing them. They don't have a written language? Brando thought that such a powerful race should be highly civilized and developed, but he did not expect them to be so ancient that they seemed to be a marginal race forgotten by the world. The Termosai are very reclusive. You will understand when you see them. Other than necessary transactions, they rarely come into contact with the civilized world. And there are very few things that are useful to them. They themselves have great power. The Termosai attribute this power to the gift of the Holy Spirit. They do not need magic items or machinery. Usually, the only things we can trade with them are pure elements, ancient runes, and everything related to the rules. Then what do we use to trade with them? Brando asked. White Mist turned around and glanced at him. I am talking about the situation of ordinary people. As for you, you are a little different. As for how different you are, you will know later. Brando said no more. The fairies sat around Malurcha's back, chattering and greeting him. Because they were the protectors of the sacred forest, the crystal stag was also a sacred and noble creature in the shallow seas. They were rare and friendly, and were the fairies' natural allies. A group of fairies and a stag took up most of the weight of the small boat. For the sake of balance, Brando had no choice but to not sit next to Andesha. He held the flaming blade, the tip of the sword pressed against her chin, in case this cunning lady had any other ideas. But Andesha's attire was a little too advanced. There were only a few vines in front of her chest that extended up her strong abdomen. It was like an evening gown with a deep V-neck. The thick vines could only cover the most private parts of a woman. Most of her full breasts were exposed, revealing a large area of beautiful but unhealthy snow-white skin. Her back, her delicate shoulders, and the parts that connected to her slender neck were all bare. Her beautiful collarbone was exposed under her neck. She looked as if she was sitting naked next to Brando. Andesha didn't care about it herself, but this extent made the latter feel a little awkward. Brando felt a little dizzy. He tried to use the flaming blade to force Andesha to sit away, but the woman seemed to sense something. She looked surprised. She licked her thick purple lips thoughtfully and unconsciously moved closer to Brando. This way, her fleshless waist and delicate skin were almost completely pressed against Brando's arm. The latter felt his scalp tingle. He understood what this cunning woman was playing. He said in a low voice, "Even here, Iroma can still feel my orders." Andesha seemed to have been pricked by a needle and bounced back. She turned her head to stare at Brando, her dark eyes almost spitting fire. Brando stared at her with his sharp white teeth. "You should know that letting you on the ship is already the biggest concession I can make." "That's because I can lead you to Gwendolyn," Anshad said hatefully. "That's also because you know that only by following me can you find her and join forces with her. I don't care what you think, but you better not waste my time," Brando said coldly, "or I'll make you understand." Andesha gritted her teeth as she listened to him, but she couldn't say a word. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling that this young man in front of her knew her better than she did. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, able to cut open her heart and guess her thoughts at any time. This feeling made her feel a chill in her heart. She recalled the time when she was plotted against by this young man in the loop of trade winds. That time was similar to now, but the difference in strength between the host and the guest was more disadvantageous to her. She silently closed her mouth. She had made up her mind to follow him for another reason. She wanted to ask about the loop of ashes, but the white mist might not answer. The ship of light cut through the mist, sailing on the sea at a moderate speed, but Brando knew that speed was meaningless here, because the distance on the path of light could be very far or very close. Sure enough, not long after, the fairies flew off Malurcha's back, cheering. He turned back to look and saw a faint outline appear behind the mist. When the outline became clear, he saw that it was an iceberg floating on the sea. They'd arrived. The fairies flew off Malurcha's back one by one, flying into the mist ahead and quickly disappearing. But the ship of light was still moving forward slowly, and a bridge gradually appeared in the mist. 2 huge teeth of some unknown monster were inserted into the water, forming the bridge pilings. There were planks covered with ice on top, and 2 chandeliers hung down from the huge teeth, glowing behind the mist. Brando saw a strange humanoid creature standing on the bridge. It was short and plump, a little like a dwarf, but it looked like a large bowling pin. It had a broad body and a small head. Its skin was smooth like a seal's, with a thick layer of fur and a thick layer of fat. There were obvious wrinkles between its neck. When the ship got closer, he noticed that the creature had no facial features. Its skin was brownish blue, and its face was painted with some strange white patterns using a special powder. It looked a little like a concentric circle. At first, Brando thought that it was its eyes, a one-eyed man. The moment he saw the creature, Brando knew that it was a Termosian. He'd seen many strange creatures in the game, but none of them were more diverse than elemental creatures. The Termosian wore a long robe. This robe was not much different from the ones Brando was familiar with, but the patterns on it were simpler, with some red wavy lines. The creature also wore a hood to cover its bald head. Although it had no eyes, Brando could feel that it was sizing him up. A few fairies landed on its shoulders. They were the fairies that had left the ship earlier, but Brando noticed that a few of them were missing. He didn't know where they had gone. The ship of light slowly approached the bridge. The Termosian standing on the bridge raised its hand, and the ship of light rose from the water. Water flowed down from the bottom of the ship like a waterfall. The ship of light rose until it was level with the bridge. The Termosian looked at him and Andesha and opened its mouth to say something. Although it said it opened its mouth, the Termosian didn't actually have a mouth. It just made some sounds. Brando didn't know where the sound came from. He suspected that it was some kind of psychic ability, because the creature's voice seemed to be transmitted directly into his mind. But he did not understand the meaning of the words at all. He only heard a gurgling sound, like a series of bubbles rising from the bottom of the water. The white mist turned its head and translated for him. It says it welcomes you. It says that you are an important guest from afar. Brando hurriedly returned the greeting, and the white mist conveyed his message. The Termosian seemed to be very happy. It hurriedly turned its body, indicating that they should disembark first. Brando jumped off the ship, followed by Andesha. Then Brando saw the Termosian bow to Malurcha. The natives living in the shallow seas were all full of respect for the crystal stag, a sacred creature. Are the Termosians all so hospitable? Brando couldn't help but ask the white mist, a little surprised. No, as I said, they are very reclusive. The white mist shook its body, shaking off the water on its body. But didn't I tell you that you are their important guest? But I've never seen these Termosians. They've never seen you either. But you're a planeswalker. That's enough, the white mist answered. After Malurcha also disembarked from the ship, the short and fat Termosian waved its fat hand. Brando then noticed that it only had 4 fingers, but it was as nimble as a human's. The ship of light instantly turned into specks of starlight and dissipated. The Termosian seemed to be born with the ability to control the light element. But what was surprising was that they were actually natives living in the water element plane. It turned its head and said something to Brando. It asked you to come with it. There may be a wise one who wants to see you. But before that, you have to bathe and change, the white mist answered immediately. Brando nodded. This was a universal body language, so there was no need for the white mist to translate. 2 people, a deer and a fox, walked along the bridge. The short and fat Termosian walked in front with a lantern. The lantern's light shot far into the fog. Brando continued with his previous question. What's the relationship between the Termosians and planeswalkers? The Termosians and planeswalkers have nothing to do with each other, the white mist answered. But do you know what kind of people are most popular in the remote countryside? It's the traveling merchants. In places where resources are scarce, merchants who can bring what the villagers need are often the most popular people. You're saying that planeswalkers are like that? Brando understood. Planeswalkers were powerful beings who could freely travel between worlds and planes. It was not surprising that they had all kinds of treasures from different worlds. But he thought to himself that although he was a planeswalker, he was at best a novice who had just started out. He did not have anything valuable on him. Or perhaps the Termosians were also interested in the cards of fate. But that thing was also very important to him. Even if he really wanted to trade it, not many would be willing to do so. Unexpectedly, the white mist shook its head in disdain. The Termosians don't want those things that you mortals think are precious. They have very few opportunities to trade with planeswalkers. Every time they do, they will cherish it. Besides, they may not have met a real planeswalker for nearly 1,000 years. Then what do they want? Brando could not help but raise his voice. The Termosian turned to look at him and nodded in a friendly manner. They want the creation of elements and laws. The light and water elements produced by your land cards, and the resources provided by the cards in your world are what they need the most. Can this be traded? Brando's eyes widened. He was really a complete novice when it came to the inheritance and knowledge of planeswalkers. Of course, the white mist looked at him disapprovingly. This is a world built by the mind. Didn't I say at the beginning? Brando was silent. After the previous series of battles, there was not much light and water elements left in his elemental pool, and the creation of Aroma's cards had almost used up all his remaining resources. According to the white mist, now he could only hope that the Termosian ticket was not too expensive. Chapter 11:21. The dense mist slowly rose to the roof with the hot air, licking the smooth ice surface. The Termosi's ice-building skills were extraordinary, at least far beyond their ability to build tents. Every piece of ice fit together seamlessly, and one could not feel the uneven surface at all. Brando soaked in the hot spring and looked at the dense mist. Just as White Mist had said, the Termosi who led him here first brought him here to bathe and change his clothes, and then arranged for him to meet with the sage. After all, meeting with the sage was a sacred ceremony for the Termosi. He had thought that there would be no environment for bathing on this floating ice, and that he would most likely have to take a stimulating ice bath. For the Termosi who were born with elemental rank power, there was no difference between taking an ice bath and taking a warm one. But when he arrived, he discovered that there was a hot spring in the middle of the igloo built by the Termosians. Naturally, there was no geothermal heat on the floating ice. This hot spring was most likely created by magic, and the Termosi did not need to maintain such a hot spring all the time. This hot spring and even this igloo were most likely specially prepared for him. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but feel a little flattered. He knew why the Termosi respected him. For a moment, he could not help but worry that the Termosi would be angry when they found out that he did not have many resources to trade with. There was a stone basin in the corner of the igloo, and the sprites lit meditation incense in the stone basin. The incense had a mysterious smell, and it rose from the ashes into the mist. The fog in front of Brendel's eyes seemed to have turned into an illusion, presenting a bizarre scene in front of him. Scenes after scenes replayed in front of him, as if he was reliving his experiences after he transmigrated. He saw the battle in the loop of trade winds. The enemies he met in that battle were far from the most ferocious, but that battle was the one that left the deepest impression on him. At the same time, it was also the most difficult battle. Even the battle in Ampere Seal, the confrontation with the Empire, and the battle with Her Majesty the Queen were far less dangerous than that. He couldn't help but touch the scar on his cheek. This scar was left behind during the battle in the loop of trade winds. There were also scars on his chest and arms. These were the scars from many battles. Although there were many ways to completely remove scars and wound, Brando didn't want to waste the effort. He wasn't like some perverted nobles who saw scars as medals, but he simply didn't think it was necessary. With a splash, he stood up from the water. The water droplets on his body naturally rolled down his well-proportioned muscles and instantly evaporated. He spread out his arms and draped a gray robe over his shoulders. The style of the robe was no different from the robes worn by the Termosians. The fairies outside the igloo seemed to have noticed the changes in the igloo. They flew into the igloo and looked at Brando curiously. They flew around him 2 or 3 times before landing on his shoulder while chattering. They held spices in their hands and carefully sprinkled them on Brando's body. Brando's nose immediately smelled a strange fragrance. He was slightly shocked, and a system prompt immediately popped up in front of his eyes. Experience gained, 17334. This was exactly 1% of his total experience. Brando immediately understood what the spices were. Thoughts of meditation. This type of spice was said to come from a certain elemental whale in the shallow seas. Its effect was to clear one's mind and allow one to examine oneself. According to the players, it directly increased experience. However, Brando had only seen thoughts of meditation that was made into incense. 1 stick could be effective for 1 minute, and every second gave 1% of the experience of the level. It was the first time he had seen something as extravagant as these fairies. The experience prompt popped up a total of 3 times, and Brando's Templar Knight and Guard of Frost Earth had risen by an entire level. How extravagant, he couldn't help but think. "Are you bringing me to see the Wise One now?" he asked. "The Wise One wants to see you," the fairies answered in unison. They were clearly saying the same thing, but they all said different things. Their voices were also chattering, and it was quite cheerful. Brando put on a shawl woven from sealskin. This was one of the necessary etiquette for meeting the Wise One. Of course he didn't know about it, but with white mist around he wouldn't make a mistake. He walked out of the igloo. White Mist and Malurcha were already waiting outside. Mayasai curled her body into the crystal stag's mane. She had been in the shallow seas for a long time, and it looked like she wasn't used to the climate here. Brando raised his head and looked into the distance. This Termosian port was called the Port of Everwinter. Although it was built on a piece of floating ice, it wasn't small. It didn't look like a temporary foothold like White Mist had said, but more like a permanent city. At least Brando could see sea walls, bridges, streets, and other permanent structures. Light ropes passed through the air above the huge floating ice, passing through the clouds and mist. In the distance there was a gray sky and a stormy sea. Ever since they entered the Sea of Fog, the shallow sea had changed. It was no longer as gentle and calm as before, but had become restless and restless. He saw the Termosian fleet in the port. It was dark and looked a bit like the Vikings' dragon-headed warships, but bigger and more spectacular. He also saw some Termosians gathered in the square. There weren't many of them, but there were at least 20 or 30 of them. These elemental creatures were rather indifferent, as if they didn't care about the visitors at all. Other than the occasional gaze he could feel most of the time, he didn't feel anyone checking him out. Other than the fairies, there were fairies everywhere in the camp, and they seemed to outnumber the Termosians. Brando didn't know whether this was normal or not, and he didn't ask White Mist. He just thought that the fairies liked to live with the Termosians. What's more, weren't the fairies who had lured him here earlier also residents of this place? The curious fairies hid in various places and quietly looked at this group of uninvited guests. They pointed at them curiously and expressed their opinions. Most of them were like, "Is this a human? How did they come here? I heard that humans are divided into men and women. Is she a man or a woman? What's that little white thing?" And so on. The little white thing, White Mist saw Brando coming out and jumped on his shoulder. "These little things are so annoying." "It's not their fault," Brando replied casually. The fairies were always curious, it was their nature. But most of them didn't mean any harm, although a few forest fairies liked to play pranks. But he immediately stopped himself. He saw a rare fire fairy. There was a square not far away. Of course, this square was not like a human square. It was often either a fountain or a statue. The square of the Termosians was their place of worship. There was a stone pillar here, and the pillar was tied with thick ropes. The ropes were full of knots, and there were different patterns painted with white dye. To the Termosians, these knots were sacred, representing the most important events that the clan had experienced in the past. Of course, only the wise could explain their origins in detail. And the sprite was sitting on the top of the stone pillar in the square. Although the stone pillar was not considered a forbidden place for the Termosians, the little one who dared to sit on the most sacred place of the Termosians was still worthy of attention. The little one had wheat-colored skin, short flame-like hair, and a bare upper body, wearing a pair of thin trousers and bare feet. His eyes shone like gold. A belt went through his shoulder and connected to the other side of his waist, where a two-handed sword was hanging in the scabbard. Of course, the sword was only about the length of Brando's palm. But a fire fairy who used a sword was rare. No, it should be said that fire fairies were rare. Fire fairies were the subjects of Forsyth. They were arrogant, smart, and had little curiosity. They were also very wary of humans. They were considered an anomaly among the fairies. And it was said that most of the fairies were female, and only the fire fairies were male. They usually lived in hot flames and rarely went to the outside world, let alone the shallow sea. There was no fire elemental that did not hate water. This is interesting. Brando glanced at the little fairy. The fire fairy seemed to have noticed them, but he just tilted his head and looked at them, then turned his attention away. They did not like humans, and they were not as curious about foreign things as other fairies. In fact, the subjects of Forsyth were a little cold. They were not as passionate as fire elemental fairies. "You noticed that fairy too?" White Mist stood on his shoulder and asked. Brando was following the group of fairies who led the way in front of him through the camp. He nodded and asked, "What is it?" "Pay attention to his scabbard. Isn't it similar to the scabbard of the flaming blade? You know that Odorfice is a fire elemental holy sword. The scabbard means that he has a part of Odorfice laws. This little guy might be a direct descendant of Forsyth. He's a fairy prince. White Mist explained softly. Fairy prince? Brando was stunned. His understanding of fairies was limited to their nature. In fact, very few people had a deep understanding of the organization of these elemental creatures. Even in the game, not many players knew about the termos. Are fairy princes very common? Common? White Mist looked at him, a little speechless. Very rare. The royal fairies rarely appear outside, let alone the subjects of Forsyth. You have to be careful later. This termos camp might be a little unusual. Brando nodded silently. At this time, the fairies had separated in front of him and lined up in 2 rows. Brando stopped and saw a huge tent in front of him. However, this tent was not like the crude huts he had seen along the way. It was more like a palace supported by 8 giant beast teeth. It was 20 to 30 meters tall, and a row of stairs made of 2 opposite smooth beast teeth extended from the entrance of the tent to his feet. Brando looked up and saw the guide he met on the trestle not far away. Of course, he could tell from the tattoos on the guide's face. After all, to him, the termos looked almost the same. There was a slight difference in height, and he could tell that they were adults and juveniles. The only difference was the tattoos on their bodies. Brando could not even tell the gender of the guide. He once wondered if the termos really had gender. However, White Mist told him that although the termos were elemental creatures, they still had gender differences. They even needed to form families to reproduce. Although others could not tell the gender of the termos from the details, there was a simple way: the female termos would not paint their faces with tattoos. Furthermore, the tattoos on the Tilmosian's face were not a mark of distinction but a symbol of status. According to White Mist, the Tilmosian who led them here had concentric circles of tattoos on his face, indicating that he was at least one of the elders of the clan. It was only then that he realized that the Tilmosians had sent an elder to lead the way for him. It was only then that he saluted the other party. While human etiquette was not commonly used in many worlds and planes, the meaning expressed in the gesture was the same. That elder also bowed to him and then said something strange. He said that the wise ones had been waiting inside for a long time, White Mist replied. Just go in? Brando asked as he looked at the half-closed curtain of the tent. Of course. The termos do not have so many red tape. That's not much? Of course, Brando was too embarrassed to say that out loud. He stretched out his hand and lifted the curtain. Then he was completely stunned. In the not spacious tent, there were 3 people standing from left to right. The one on the far left was a woman. She was tall and slim, but she had a graceful and luxurious temperament. She wore a silver crown on her head and wore a silk robe with the unique temperament of elves. She held a scepter in her hand, but her whole person was not real, but a virtual image projected by magic. Brando knew this woman. She was the queen of the tree elves, the mother of the little elves, whom he had met once on the evergreen walkway. Beside her was a woman with an even colder expression. She had short hair and wore a simple gray robe. There were no decorations on her body. Even the belt that tied her robe was only a long linen rope. Brando was familiar with her attire. The ascetics from all over Wone looked just like this. But compared to her attire, Brando was more familiar with her. She was Eloranta, the only human sage on the land after 1,000 years of the War of the Holy Saints. As for the third person, a little fairy with a laurel crown on her head, Brando almost ignored her. After all, compared to the previous 2, this little fairy whom he had never seen before could not attract any of his attention. But before the sage and the elven queen spoke, the little fairy was the first to speak. And she was not even speaking to Brando. She stared at Malurcha, who was beside Brando, and said, "Mr. Malurcha?" Brando was stunned. Malurcha was also stunned. He asked blankly, "Rose?" Chapter 11:22. No, you're not Rose. Malurcha raised his head and stared at the fairy who was floating in the air not far away with eyes that seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. The latter was so lazy that it seemed like she would never wake up. Her eyes were calm as if there was a deep lake in them. They were dark blue with a hint of green. They were completely different from the lively and curious eyes of the other fairies. She always gave people a feeling of calmness and indifference. She heard Malurcha's words and bowed to him gracefully. "I am Tata Talamis Thumb, the protector of the ice fairies. Rose is my sister, Mr. Malurcha." As she spoke, the north wind was blowing from the top of the tent. Snowflakes fell from the gaps and disappeared on the ground. "You're Rose's sister," Malurcha said in surprise. "Rose, the fairies' lives are short and long. Rose's life has already continued in this world in another way. Birth and death, the cycle of life is endless. This is the will of the shallow sea. Tata looked at Phaeth, who had wrapped her mane around herself and was looking at her curiously with her head tilted. The pair of emerald blue eyes on her face shone like gems. It was exactly the same as her sister's eyes when she looked at her 1,000 years ago. The latter was always so innocent and lively, full of curiosity about everything in the world. She nodded slightly and said, "But I still have to thank you for taking care of her. I can feel her attachment to you, Mr. Malurcha." Malurcha lowered his head and scratched the ice with his hooves. He seemed a little excited. It took Brendel some time to figure out what had happened between Mias and Marlowe. He couldn't help but think back to the sacred forest in the darkness. It was as silent as winter, and the branches of ice and snow spread silently. There was no sign of life, but there was a noble life that was willing to risk its life to protect it. It was because the memory of a little fairy named Rose was buried there. It was silent under the snow. Although time flew by, its memories of the past often became clearer. There seemed to be a low voice singing in the wind. The fairies were singing in a low voice. "Don't feel sad for the dead, for life is endless. Don't cry for the dead, for new sprouts will always grow on the rotten soil. After the end of all things, comes the new birth of the world. Traveler, please go on, the whispers in the wind accompany you and me." Brando looked at the fairy lady in silence. He believed that this very unique fairy lady had not led them here to confirm news of her sister. The appearance of the elven queen of the Ring of the World and the sage Eleranta's projections explained many things. This was an unexpected meeting, and the key was why he was the protagonist of this meeting. Furthermore, the lifespan of fairies was short. Of course, light fairies with elemental rank like Tanya were an exception. But from the description of this fairy lady, she should have lived for thousands of years. Even as the light fairies with the longest lifespan, this was outrageous, not to mention that she wasn't one. Brendel could not help but think of Eleranta. As a mortal, this sage had obviously lived for too long. Brando turned his head to look at White Mist on his shoulder and saw that the latter was frowning slightly. He looked at the fairy lady again. Tata's expression was still indifferent, as if she would not take the initiative to speak if he did not speak. Brando had to ask softly, "Miss Tilias, are you the one who wants to see me? Are you the sage of the port of Everwinter?" Tata spoke softly. Her voice was ethereal and calm, as if it could soothe the anxiety and uneasiness in people's hearts. "I am the protector of Quilinthe. I came here 1,000 years ago because of an agreement with Sir Odin. After Master Manlin left, I am the only sage here. Quilinthe is in the south of the shallow sea. That is the home of fairies, Mr. Brando," she added. "You know me?" Brando immediately realized that he had asked a silly question. Sure enough, she looked at the elven queen and did not answer. Unlike the other fairies, she did not seem to like to talk. She was so quiet that it made people curious. Brando frowned again and asked, "What is the agreement between you and the Dark Dragon? Can the sage of the Termosai people also be non-Termosai?" White Mist on his shoulder answered his question. She replied softly, "The most important thing is the inheritance, but very few sprites will become wise ones." Her words were self-evident. With the sprites' cheerful personalities, it was obvious that no one would think that they were reliable. Even Lady Tanya, whom he met among the Bugas, was full of all kinds of mischief ideas. But this fairy lady in front of him was clearly different. Just by standing there, she gave people a different feeling. It was as if she was a thick book, quietly opening its pages for people to read. Her calm eyes revealed the aura of knowledge and wisdom. Lady Turlias is the blessed of the crystal. Her memories include 1/3 of the knowledge in the World Library. In fact, she is not only the sage of the port of Everwinter, but also an omniscient sage of the entire Termosai world. The Elven Queen's projection smiled and explained to Brando. Brando hurriedly nodded at her, but then he saw a little girl poking her head out from behind the Elven Queen. She grabbed her mother's skirt with one hand and pressed her lower eyelid with the other, making a face at Brando. "Hypocrite, you betrayed me!" the naughty little princess angrily shouted. "Emily!" The Elven Queen could no longer maintain her dignity. She angrily scolded the future Princess White, which was now the nickname of the naughty little princess, and angrily chased her to the back. "Go back to your room. Guards, take the princess away." Brando's forehead was immediately covered in cold sweat. But what really affected his mood was not the naughty little elf, but the Elven Queen's words. He could not help but take a few more glances at the quiet fairy lady. The World Library was the treasure trove of knowledge in Ababel Fortress. After the Tower of Babel fell apart, the knowledge and inheritance in it were completely lost on the earth. For thousands of years, some people might occasionally find a word or two in it, and the knowledge they obtained would be unprecedented, and they could even build a new civilization on the earth. Tumen had only obtained the inheritance of the elemental circle from a fragment of the war slate, and thus established the modern magic system. He could be said to be the mentor of all elementalists and wizards, but the knowledge he had was not worth mentioning in the era when Babel Tower still existed in the modern world. But now someone told him that there was still someone in this world who had 1/3 of the knowledge in the treasure vault. And the person who held the key to the knowledge vault was, in his impression, an individual of the fairy race who was not very smart, an ice fairy. When he looked at the fairy lady again, it was as if he was looking at a library floating in the air. This library was probably more majestic than the White Tower of the Silver Bugas. It included all the knowledge and inheritance on the earth today. It was even more than that. I recognize you. White Mist suddenly jumped down from Brando's shoulder at this time. She landed on the ground and looked up at the others. White Mist stared at Miss Tata Tilia's thumbs and muttered to herself, "You are the Holy One." The fairy lady nodded quietly. "I am one of the 7 Holy Ones, Madame Mozakisis White Mist, one of the ancient saints of the witches." "I don't remember that clearly," White Mist replied. "Let me think. You are Alanta. Who are you?" "In that era I was called Leia." The Elven Queen replied. "You are the daughter of the great druid of the past." White Mist looked at her with sparkling eyes. "I recognize you." The Elven Queen smiled and nodded. "I swear to witness everything," she said. "I also bear witness to everything for him." The fairy lady also spoke in an ethereal and calm tone. "And I bear witness to everything for Wond." Lastly it was Elaranta. This sage's voice was deep and deep. It was very neutral, but it didn't make people feel uncomfortable. White Mist looked at them. 3 Holy Ones, the 7 Holy Ones have reappeared. Only the Bugas, the dragon, the silver elf, and that person are missing. So you are here for me? Alanta nodded. Brando frowned slightly. He looked at White Mist and realized that the protagonist of this meeting was actually the latter. But it was not surprising that Alanta knew White Mist. They were from the same era. It was just that the conversation between the 4 of them made him feel like he was falling into a fog. He had also heard of the name of the Holy Ones before. That was in a certain background of the game. Legend has it that the sage Alanta kept an agreement with Gretel and Fanzan and walked the earth for a long time, guarding the covenant made by the mortals in the War of the Holy Ones, the sacred oath. She was the Holy Ones, which was why she was immortal. But there was also a period of investigation about what the Holy Ones were, but most of it was unresolved. Brando once thought that it was a special state of perfect body until some people unearthed some remnants of the war slate from under the ruins of Feyran. The inscription on the slate mentioned an incomplete fragment of the Holy Ones. It described a passage, the key of the mortal world, the lock of the clock. Players speculated based on the inscription and some documents that it should be a metaphor for something like clockwork, because there was a similar fragment in the Pale poem. But before he transmigrated, that was all there was to the investigation. However, Brando did not ask and just listened silently. He knew that now was not the time to interrupt. The sage, the fairy, and the Elven Queen were obviously not talking to him. Bai Wu silently glanced at the others. "You know? We knew from the moment the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn entered the elemental world. Miss Tilia's also found clues from her knowledge," the Elven Queen replied. "The tree herders deceived all of us. This is the negligence of the Holy Ones. That is why we came to you for help," Alanta also said. Brando could not help but look at White Mist. He did not expect the sage to ask her for help. White Mist looked around at everyone and replied, "It's not your fault. After all, only a few people know the true identity of the baby girl. However, the Circle of Ashes has been planning for this for thousands of years. Perhaps they will succeed." "She can't succeed," the fairy replied calmly. "Although Gwendolyn deceived everyone, she can't deceive the Twilight Dragon. Odin has already seen all of this. If that's the case, why did he make a promise with you for 1,000 years? White Mist stared at them and asked. Alanta was silent for a long time. Then she slowly said, "Because he has been waiting for that person, the destined person in the Pale Poem's prophecy, but that person still failed." The fairy waited for the sage to finish before continuing. "The Twilight Dragon's will in the baby girl's body is a conspiracy." The Circle of Ashes did not find any relevant words in the documents of the sage. They may have been deceived. Mr. Odin has long suspected that this is the reason why the Ancient Council did not execute the baby girl. Unfortunately, he did not have time to reopen the Truth Council. The White Mist looked steadily at her and at Alanta. If it weren't for you, this wouldn't have happened. The War of the Holy Saints was instigated by Mr. Odin. The Flaming Blade, the Sacred Wind Empress, the 4 holy artifacts, were all given to us by him. Ilanta replied softly. The prophet in the Valley of the Holy Saints was Teacher Tumun, wasn't it? Because he is a fool. Mr. Odin is not ignorant, because he knows that the power of the gods has declined. If the level of order in Wond is not reduced, the twilight will come. White Mist jumped up as if she had been pricked by a needle. She stared at Ilanta uneasily. You know? I have 1,000 years to remember, and I will always remember those sad memories, Ilanta replied slowly. Mr. Odin stood guard for us for the last 1,000 years. Now that the gods have long left, the mortals will have to rely on themselves to save themselves. She looked at White Mist as if looking at a time in the past. There were many riddles in that time, but they had all been solved one by one. You want to stop Gwendolyn? Stop the twilight from coming? White Mist asked. Do you know what Odin paid for this? The Elven Queen was silent. Ilanta nodded. The mortals are not ready for the final battle. We must not let the Twilight Dragon come early. This is Mr. Odin's will. But have you ever thought, White Mist asked, after you die, everything about the past may be completely lost, and the mortals will never have a chance to return to that era. But sometimes some people have no choice. Like him? Like Mr. Odin? Ilanta replied. Well, White Mist nodded, I admit that sometimes the world does need some fools, but now my ability is limited. You have to come up with a plan yourselves. What are you going to do? The wise ones and I cannot enter the elemental plane. Once we enter the elemental plane, the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn will immediately notice, the Elven Queen replied. We need someone to bring the keystone into the elemental plane. Who, this fairy lady? White Mist shook her head. She can't. She can't pass through the mountain of quenching storms. You'd better find a Termosian to go with me. A Termosian will not enter the mountain of quenching storms, the fairy lady replied. Actually, we have already found a good candidate. Oh, White Mist asked. Ilanta, the fairy lady, and the Elven Queen turned their heads at the same time. Brando frowned as he pondered over the meaning of these words, but suddenly he felt the eyes of the 3 ladies fall on him. Chapter 11:24. Are you talking about me? Brando was slightly stunned. The Elven Queen nodded slightly and replied, Mr. Brando, your intention here is to stop the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn and rescue the Roman lady. We have the same goal. As long as you bring the keystone to the Earth Elemental Realm, we will have the opportunity to teleport to the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn's side. We will then have the opportunity to stop her ritual and prevent the Twilight Dragon from descending into this world. Brando's heart skipped a beat, but he did not show it on his face. He asked calmly, Your Majesty, can the descent of the Twilight Dragon be stopped? The Elven Queen looked at Tata Tilla's thumbs. The fairy lady who seemed to have never woken up thought for a moment and replied, Theoretically, it is possible. Gwendolyn may choose to open the 3 nodes, Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha, Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha, and Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Rho Alpha, causing the mana to collapse in waves. If we can find the frequency pattern of the 3rd layer's resonance and cut off the 7th to 14th ring points, as long as we can occupy the passage for 4 units of time, we will have the opportunity to intervene in the ritual. The prerequisite is that we must be very close. Brando felt as if he had heard a heavenly book. Even his head felt as if it had swelled up. At this moment he finally remembered why he chose to be a warrior and not a wizard. The Elven Queen could not help but shake her head with a bitter smile. Miss Tata, please be concise, she reminded. The fairy lady made an "oh" sound and touched her forehead with her hand as if the question had troubled her. But after thinking for a moment she finally found an explanation that even a normal person with a dull brain could understand. Simply put, it is possible but not certain. There is probably no more than a 30% chance. If we can go deeper into the Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer to analyze the specific direction of the mana flow, we may be able to analyze which law she is using. Perhaps we can increase the chance of success by 5%. But this will take more time. Do you know the Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer? The Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer is the lowest layer of the law of Tiamat. It is composed of a layer of formatted mana. It is, stop. Brando raised his left hand and made a stop gesture, stopping Miss Sprite from continuing her work. He did not want to feel like a primary school student if she continued. I think I understand, but I have another question. What should I do? The Elven Queen continued, Lady Eloranta will make a keystone. Mr. Brando, take this keystone and pass through the mountain of ceasing storms. Enter the elemental world and find the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn and get as close to her as possible. Once we have the coordinates, we will immediately teleport over. And then? Do we join forces to stop the ritual? Brando asked. He had come into contact with keystones both in the game and after coming to this world. It was divided into two, and it was actually a spatial anchor point that could transmit spatial coordinates in both directions. The royal family of Covardo's fleet used it for positioning and teleportation. However, the teleportation of the fleet required a spatial magnification circle, which was much simpler for Eloranta and the others. The Elven Queen shook her head. It's not that simple. Once the ritual begins, even killing the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn will not help. It will only make things worse. We have to intervene and interrupt the ritual first. We can only rely on Lady Tilia's calculations. You plan to invade the Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer and interfere with the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn's ritual from the direction of the flow of mana? Brando suddenly remembered something when he heard the word, calculations. In fact, he was not completely ignorant of mystical knowledge. Although his knowledge of more advanced knowledge and the magic network was almost zero, he still knew some of the basics. The law of Tiamat was divided into 7 layers. The Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha, Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha, and Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha were its lower 3 layers. The Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer filtered the dark mana and transformed it into orderly power. The Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha and Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer were the distribution layers. The former classified the mana, while the latter determined the final flow of mana to the last 4 layers. However, when the Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer distributed the mana, the direction of the flow of mana had already shown signs from the Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer. However, except for a few scholars who were proficient in the magic network, most wizards could not control the magic network deep into this layer. When a wizard cast a spell, the only thing that determined was the law used and the amount of mana used. The last 3 layers of the law of Tiamat were the law layers. The 4th layer, Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Eta, was the calculation layer. Most wizards who were proficient in magic could only go deep into this layer. Only a few could reach the Pi Alpha Nu Delta Omega Sigma Alpha layer. Because the law at the bottom had a certain degree of autonomy, there was no need for wizards to waste precious spiritual power. He could not help but glance at the fairy. If the latter had the ability to do so, she would be a genius among geniuses in magic. Throughout history, those who could touch the first layer of the law of Tiamat were all amazing figures. For example, the few leaders of the Silver Alliance. However, when he looked at the fairy, Tata also looked at him in surprise. You've studied mysticism systematically? The composition of the world's foundation was not necessary for apprentices of the law of adepts. Usually, they could only understand the nature of the world after they came into contact with the elemental field. However, this was not a problem for players. Modern technology had ways to directly describe any model for them. Brando nodded and found an excuse. I'm also an elementalist. Very good. The fairy nodded approvingly. It was not clear whether she was praising Brando's solid foundation or praising his extraordinary achievements in so many fields at such a young age. She had already known from the Elven Queen that the young man in front of her was a genuine sword saint. However, in fact, most elementalists did not study mysticism. In Wond, there were many elementalists who did not know anything about the law of Tiamat. Usually, they only needed to have enough elemental affinity. However, it was said that for some old-fashioned wizards, or even wizards who had received ancient legacies, it was natural for all spellcasters to have a systematic grasp of mystical knowledge. It was said that before the Age of Light, wizards had to spend decades learning pure theoretical knowledge before they could embark on the path of magic. At that time, wizards, elementalists, string magicians, and even witches were scholars first and then the latter. Obviously, the fairy was a wizard who grew up under the influence of such thinking. If that's the case, Brando replied, I may be able to help. I have some ether dragons. They live in the highest level of the Sea of Magic. Their energy attribute is enough for them to easily enter the Medusa Stratum. Miss Tata, you should know that ether dragons are actually a kind of mutated magic. You can summon ether dragons? The Elven Queen said with some surprise. If that's the case, the chances will be even higher. Mr. Brando, you've really helped us a lot. Our goal is the same, Your Majesty, Brando said modestly. 10%, the fairy said. What do you mean? If we can use the ether dragons, we can increase the chances by 10%, Tata replied concisely. That's 45%. It's already very high. Brando thought for a moment and asked the question he was most concerned about. But what happens after the ritual is stopped? He knew that stopping the ritual would only interrupt the process of Twilight's descent, but the will of the Twilight Dragon had always left an imprint on the Roman's soul. Even if it didn't erupt this time, it would descend again sooner or later. At this time the sage finally spoke. This depends on whether the Twilight Dragon can be resealed after the ritual is stopped. How do we seal the Twilight Dragon? What will the Roman do? What about you? Brando remembered the conversation they had with the White Mist and vaguely felt that something was wrong. The Elven Queen only smiled at this question but did not answer. Eloranta shook her head. Little guy who is favored by the Saint Tassel, we can only do our best. If we fail, you can take this to that person. The fairy held a sparkling sapphire in both hands. She flew to Brando, looked up at him, and then placed the gem in the latter's hand. Brando looked at the gem in his hand and found that in the center of dozens of geometrically polished surfaces, there was a very beautiful imprint in the middle of the aquamarine crystal. The imprint was like a towering tree, but it also seemed to be some kind of complicated magic circle. It was as thin as a piece of paper and was embedded in the center of the crystal. What is this? He picked up the gem and asked Eloranta, who is that person, sage? If we fail, it will naturally tell you everything, Eloranta replied. This time, Brando seemed to understand the meaning behind her words and couldn't help but frown. If we fail, sage, what will you do? If we fail, at this time, the White Mist jumped back onto Brando's shoulder and whispered, no one will be spared, Brando. Brando was slightly startled and then understood. His gaze landed on the projections of the fairy lady, the wise one of the earth and the Elven Queen, and he nodded lightly. Then please give me the keystone, he said, but I need someone to bring me to the mountain of calming storms, wise one. No problem, Tata replied. Elder Cobb will arrange the fleet, but if you need a guide to the mountain of ceasing storms, there is actually a better candidate here. P.S. I'm done sorting out my thoughts. The first update is here. The next update depends on whether it will be at noon or in the afternoon. Speaking of which, students, last month's update was pretty awesome, right? Please give me monthly votes. Please give me more. This month I will be just as awesome. Can I fight for full attendance? Also, I recommend the Silly Moon Breeze's new book, The Silent Crown, but his standards are still very high. You should know it well, so I won't go into detail. Chapter 11:25. A better candidate? Brando was a little confused. But as far as I know, shouldn't the Termosai be the natives of the White Cape the most? He said as he looked at the white fog. In theory, yes, or you can say that in this part of the sea. The sprite replied in a flat voice. But it's not necessarily true for a specific individual. For example, I know more about this world than the Termosai. Brando could not help but raise his eyebrows. The sprite was said to have mastered 1/3 of the knowledge of the world's library. In terms of understanding of the shallow sea, even the Silver Scholar, the guardian of the great library of the Bugas, was not as detailed as her, let alone the Termosai. Miss Tata, do you mean that the person is you? But the Dragon Queen won't notice you? The sprite shook her head gently. I'm just giving an example. That person is a guest of the port of Everwinter. You will see him soon. His understanding of the elemental barrier is not much worse than mine, so you don't have to worry about his ability. So, Brando asked, where is this gentleman? Tata reached out and flicked her hand forward. A transparent ripple passed through Brando and spread out of the tent. Then she turned her gaze back to Brando and said, he is at the port of Everwinter. You don't have to leave so quickly. The speed of time here is only a fraction of the speed of the outside world. I suggest you stay and rest. After all, the journey to the elemental world of Earth is not as safe as people think. And I have something here for you. But before that, I suggest you attend a trade fair between ships. As for that gentleman, I will arrange for you to meet him there. A trade fair between ships? Brando asked, is it a Termosai trade fair? Tata nodded. The Termosai people don't have a fixed residence. They drift on the sea all year round. When they meet each other, it's a very precious opportunity for them to exchange experience, sea maps, and some necessities. So, such transactions often happen on the light path. Secondly, when the Termosai people meet a planeswalker, they will often inform the nearby ships to gather and hold a bigger trade fair. Planeswalker? Brando asked carefully. In fact, ever since he heard White Mist's description, he had always been interested in it. Putting aside the fact that the Spring of Youth had appeared at the trade fair, he was also eager to obtain some equipment to increase his strength. His trip to the Earth Elemental Plane this time would most likely involve him fighting the Dragon Queen. Although his own strength was comparable to that of a supreme class, it was still insufficient in the face of a sage's domain. Most of his normal equipment had been destroyed in the battle with Haku for the war slate. So, even if it was the lowest level of magic equipment, he was in a hurry to get himself a new set. Just like how human sailors need to prepare food and fresh water before going out to sea, Termosai people need to prepare all kinds of pure elements when they travel along the path of light. These elements are not the violent elemental power that the elementalists have mastered, but the basic elements that have been converted into order. Basically, only planeswalkers can provide them. Brando nodded silently. He understood that the so-called basic element was the element produced by his land card. That element was indeed very different from the elemental power of the elemental user gate. It was precisely because he was an elemental user that he knew this better. After the ripples from Miss Fairy's fingertips spread out of the tent's curtains were lifted by a short, fat hand. The Termosai elder who had led Brando's way previously came in from outside the tent. He first bowed deeply to everyone present, including Brando. It was as White Mist had said, in the eyes of the Termosai people, the status of planeswalkers was no lower than that of the Wise Ones or even the Wise Ones. Then the elder straightened his short, fat body and looked at Miss Fairy. "Elder Keb, bring Mr. Brando to the Holy Church for a meal," Tata said to him. "Also, arrange for the fleet. We have to set off before the 7th month, at least through the Sea of Mist before then." The Termosai elder, who was called Elder Keb, nodded, but his short, fat hand did not leave his chest at all. He only turned his body sideways and bowed to Brando, making a very human gesture of please. Even though Brando did not understand the Termosai people, he understood that this obviously human etiquette was obviously not something they should have. The elder did this only to express his respect for him. He hurriedly whispered his thanks. But before he left, Brando bowed to the Wise Ones and the Elven Queen again. This bow had nothing to do with his identity, but was purely to express his respect for them. He clearly understood what they would have to pay in order to seal dusk. "Mr. Brando, I wish you success in advance," the Elven Queen said with a smile. "You will definitely save the Roman lady." Eloranta also nodded slightly, and then the two figures gradually faded until they disappeared. Miss Fairy turned a blind eye to this scene. She just waved her hand gently, indicating for Elder Keb to take the ladder away. The wooden deck of the cabin was narrow and dark, slowly tilting to one side. The sea slammed against the side of the ship, as if it would not stop until the worm-eaten planks were smashed to pieces. The whole ship made a frightening creaking sound as if it could fall apart at any time. Brando looked through the porthole at the stormy sea outside. The white waves chased each other, forming huge waves that could topple mountains and overturn seas. In the storm, several dragon-headed warships were faintly discernible. Sometimes they completely sank under the waves, leaving almost only a bare mast on the sea. This storm was far worse than the small winds and waves he had seen on the Sea of Naga. Even White Mist's expression was a little solemn. This storm was much worse than the one this lady had seen when she passed through the Sea of Mist last time. The abnormal weather seemed to be indicating something. Only Miss Fias could continue to be heartless, just like the common trait of their race. The little sprite sat on the desk, licking her fingers attentively. She started licking her right pinky finger, and her pink tongue deftly licked all the way to her thumb, not letting go of any corner of her finger that was stained with sugar water. Brando gently put down the knife and fork in his hand as he listened to the little sprite licking her fingers. The fish in the wooden plate was neatly cut and placed on ice. The bright red and clear fish meat was poured with a fermented product made of seal fat and fish eggs unique to the Termosian people. This dish was called Kasidica, the most important dish in the Termosian people's biggest festival. The water elemental tuna was rare and difficult to catch. It was the rarest food in the shallow sea and even in the whole of Wonde. The meat of the elemental tuna was plump and tough, with a hint of cold freshness, and left a rich aftertaste. As for the fermented sauce of the Termosian people, it was a matter of opinion. The sound of horns came from outside the window and Brendel turned his head. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the Termosian warships emitting beams of light. These beams of light broke through the wind and waves, penetrating the turbulent waves and the dark sea, shooting into the rain and fog ahead. What happened? Howrin could not help but ask. The Termosai acted quickly. It only took them a few hours to organize a large fleet. However, the fleet did not head directly to the end of White Cape. Instead they sailed north. The port of Everwinter had informed the nearby Termosai fleet to attend the trade fair. The trade fair was said to be held in the Bone Sea, a part of the sea north of the port of Everwinter that was shrouded in storms all year round. Brando did not know why the Termosian people would choose such a place for the trade fair. In his opinion, such a trade fair should be in an area with calm seas or at least better weather conditions. However, he rarely guessed the actions of these natives, just like now. White Mist scooped up a shallow sea crab with her claws and put it into her mouth. Waves of rich water elemental energy emanated from under her fur. She closed her eyes in comfort and replied, "We're almost there. They're notifying the nearby fleet." Fleets from other clans? White Mist nodded. Why would they choose such a place to trade? Brendel furrowed his brows as he looked at the storm outside. The dark clouds in the distant sky almost reached the sea, and the dense lightning bolts intersected with the waves, illuminating the sea. It was a spectacular scene, but people who were in the middle of it would not think so. They would only feel that a great disaster was coming, as if the end of the world had arrived. Although Brando was slightly better, he was still not used to it. No matter how brave and fearless the people on land were, they would never be able to adapt to the changes of the sea. Endesha, who was standing outside the door, entered several times. Even Brando could see that the matriarch of the tree herders was uneasy. She had the divine blood of Fenritos in her body, and after turning into a plant, she was more attached to the earth, and even more uncomfortable with the life of a rootless duckweed. Just like this moment, she pushed open the door and walked in again. The ship that Brando was on was not one of the Termosian warships. In fact, the ship called Orbawolf was the flagship of this fleet. Its shape was a little strange, and it did not look like any ship Brando had seen before. It looked more like a platform on the sea, but it was made of wood and reinforced with magic. Because of this, the rooms on the ship were at least spacious. Although the room that Brando brought with him was not as beautiful as his office in Valhalla, it was much better than the dark corridor outside. Endesha's appearance was different from ordinary people, but her sense of beauty had not changed much. She also pursued a comfortable life. Even if she was a little unhappy to be in the same room as Brando, it was still the same. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.